The Winds of Justice, a novel by Jonathan Florian Ratch. Chapter 1. A terrible tragedy. The Aston Martin DB12 purred along the winding mountain road like a contented predator, its V12 engine barely straining as it carved through the curves with surgical precision. Jonathan Ratch's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, his touch confident but relaxed. At 38, he had the bearing of a man who had conquered every challenge life had thrown at him until today. "I still can't believe you actually bought this car," Mary laughed from the passenger seat, her honey-blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the panoramic roof. "When you showed me the specs 6 months ago, I thought you were just daydreaming again." Jonathan glanced at his wife of 5 years, and his heart did that familiar little skip it had been doing since the day they met at the MIT Engineering Symposium. Mary wasn't just beautiful, though God knew she was stunning. She was brilliant. Dr. Mary Catherine Ratch, with her PhD in materials science and her laugh that could light up a room. She understood his work, his passion, his obsession with pushing the boundaries of what was possible. "Daydreaming got us everything we have," Jonathan replied, downshifting as they approached a particularly sharp turn. "Besides, after the Pentagon contract came through, I figured we'd earned a little celebration." Mary reached over and placed her hand on his thigh, her touch warm through the fabric of his custom-tailored charcoal suit. "You mean you earned it? The Jonathan Ratch Advanced Materials Laboratory is hardly a wee enterprise, darling. Don't start with that again." Jonathan's voice carried a note of playful warning. "You know damn well I couldn't have done any of this without you. Who do you think talks me down from my 3 a.m. eureka moments? Who makes sure I eat something other than coffee and protein bars when I'm in the zone? And who makes sure you remember to sleep occasionally?" Mary added with a grin. "Exactly. Partners in crime." Jonathan lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Besides, you're the one who figured out the carbon nanotube weaving pattern that made the new composite possible. I'm just the guy who had the crazy idea to build a suit that could withstand a direct hit from an RPG." That was Jonathan's gift, seeing impossible things and making them real. At 25, fresh out of his dual PhD program at MIT, he'd started Ratch Industries with nothing but a revolutionary new approach to materials engineering and a borrowed garage. 13 years later, his company held over 200 patents, employed 1,500 people, and had government contracts worth more than the GDP of small countries. The house they were returning to was testament to that success, a sprawling modernist masterpiece perched on 50 acres of forested mountainside, all glass and steel and impossible angles. Jonathan had designed it himself, naturally, incorporating everything from solar collection arrays to a workshop that would make NASA jealous. The basement alone was a 10,000 square foot laboratory where he pursued his more unconventional projects. "You know what I love most about this road?" Mary mused, gazing out at the valley spread below them. "No matter how successful you become, no matter how many people want a piece of you, up here it's just us. Just Jonathan and Mary Ratch, taking a drive in their ridiculously expensive car." Jonathan was about to respond when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. About a quarter-mile ahead, 3 large black SUVs were parked across the road, completely blocking their path. His engineer's mind immediately began calculating angles and vectors, escape routes and probable outcomes. "Mary," he said quietly, his hand already moving toward the center console where he kept his service pistol. "I need you to put your seatbelt on. Now." The urgency in his voice wiped the smile from Mary's face. She followed his gaze and saw the roadblock. "What is this? Construction?" "No." Jonathan's voice was grim as he began to slow the Aston Martin. "This is something else entirely." As they drew closer, Jonathan could see figures moving around the vehicles. Men in tactical gear, moving with military precision. His stomach dropped as he recognized the profile of one figure standing near the center vehicle, a man he'd hoped never to see again. Frank Morrison. Jonathan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Morrison was supposed to be in federal prison, serving a 10-year sentence for defense contract fraud. The fact that he was standing free on a mountain road with a squad of armed men could only mean one thing: someone with serious pull had intervened. Jonathan. Mary's voice was smaller now, tinged with fear. Who are those people? Frank Morrison, Jonathan said, already throwing the car into reverse. The sound of squealing tires behind them cut him off. In the rearview mirror, Jonathan saw two more SUVs racing up the road, moving to block their retreat. They were trapped. Oh God, Mary whispered. Jonathan, what does he want? Jonathan's mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. Morrison had always been jealous of Jonathan's success, his patents, his government contracts. Morrison's own company, Aegis Defense Systems, had been built on stolen technology and bribes. When Jonathan had provided the evidence that put Morrison behind bars, he'd made an enemy for life. Listen to me carefully, Jonathan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I'm going to stop the car. When I do, you stay inside. The dress you're wearing has the protective lining I developed, it'll stop most small arms fire. But you stay in the car no matter what happens. Do you understand me? Mary nodded, her face pale but determined. What about you? Jonathan opened his jacket slightly, revealing the thin, but sophisticated body armor woven into the fabric of his suit. I'll be fine. Just remember, no matter what you see, you stay in the car. The Aston Martin came to a complete stop about 50 yards from the roadblock. Jonathan could see Morrison clearly now, tall, lean, with the kind of predatory smile that had made him successful in the defense contracting world. His sandy hair was shorter than Jonathan remembered, and there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before prison. Mr. Ratch. Morrison called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. How wonderful to see you again. Please, step out of your beautiful car. I think it's time we had a conversation. Jonathan opened his door slowly, keeping his hands visible. Frank. I thought you were enjoying federal hospitality for the next 8 years. Morrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. Funny how things work out when you have the right friends in the right places. Turns out there was some irregularity in the evidence against me. Prosecutorial misconduct. Tainted witness testimony. You know how it is. I know exactly how it is, Jonathan replied, his voice steady. I know you've got half the Defense Procurement Office on your payroll. I know you've been stealing technology from smaller companies for years. And I know that sooner or later, the truth catches up with people like you. The truth. Morrison's expression hardened. Let me tell you about truth, Jonathan. The truth is that while I was sitting in a concrete box, you were living in your glass palace, making billions off technology that should have been mine. The truth is that you destroyed my life, my company, everything I worked for. You destroyed your own life the moment you decided to steal from people who trusted you, Jonathan shot back. I just made sure the world knew about it. Morrison nodded slowly, as if considering this. Maybe so. But that doesn't change the fact that you cost me everything. My company, my freedom, my reputation. And now, well. Now it's time to balance the scales. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. What do you want, Frank? What I want is simple, Morrison replied, reaching inside his jacket. I want you to know what it feels like to lose everything. Morrison's hand emerged holding a military-grade assault rifle, one of his own company's designs. Jonathan recognized it immediately, the Aegis M47, capable of firing 850 rounds per minute with devastating accuracy. "This is illegal, Frank," Jonathan called out, his voice carrying across the silent road. "Whatever you think you're going to accomplish here, it's not worth it. You walk away now, and we can pretend this never happened." Morrison's smile was cold and empty. "Oh, but it is worth it, Jonathan. It's worth everything." The first burst of gunfire shattered the mountain's silence like thunder. Jonathan felt the impact of the bullets slam into his chest and legs, the force of them knocking him backward and down onto the asphalt. The body armor held barely, but the kinetic energy was still enough to drive the breath from his lungs and send shock waves of pain through his entire body. Through the ringing in his ears, Jonathan heard Mary scream his name. He tried to call out to her, to tell her to stay in the car, to drive away, to do anything but what she was doing. But his voice was lost in the chaos of the moment, and his body wasn't responding the way it should. Mary was out of the car now, running toward him with tears streaming down her face. "Jonathan. Oh God, Jonathan, please be okay." She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his body, afraid to touch him for fear of making his injuries worse. Jonathan tried to speak, tried to tell her that he was okay, that the armor had held, but all that came out was a pained gasp. Morrison approached them slowly, the rifle still in his hands. Well, well. Look at that. The great Jonathan Ratch, brought low by a few well-placed bullets. "I have to admit, I'm impressed by your body armor. My rifles usually don't leave much behind." Mary looked up at Morrison, her eyes blazing with fury. "You monster! What have you done to him?" "What I've done," Morrison said conversationally, "is exactly what he did to me. I've destroyed his life, piece by piece. First his company will crumble when word gets out about his death. Then his patents will be tied up in court for years. And finally, his legacy will be nothing but a footnote in the history of defense contracting." Jonathan tried to push himself up, tried to protect Mary, but his body still wasn't responding properly. The armor had absorbed most of the impact, but the shock was still working its way through his system. Morrison looked down at Mary, and something shifted in his expression. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ratch. I really am. But I can't leave any witnesses. You understand?" "No," Jonathan managed to gasp, finally finding his voice. "Frank, please. She has nothing to do with this. Let her go." Morrison raised the rifle again, and Jonathan saw his wife's face, in what he suddenly realized might be the last moment of her life. Mary looked at him, and despite everything, despite the terror and the pain and the certain knowledge of what was about to happen, she smiled. "I love you," she whispered. "Whatever happens, I love you." The second burst of gunfire was shorter, but no less devastating. Jonathan watched in horror as bullets tore through Mary's dress, most of them stopped by the protective lining he'd woven into the fabric. But not all of them. One bullet found its mark in her neck, piercing her jugular artery. Blood began to flow, dark and terrible, and Mary's eyes went wide with shock and pain. "Mary!" Jonathan screamed, his voice breaking. "Mary, no." Morrison lowered the rifle and looked down at his handiwork with satisfaction. "And that, Jonathan, is how it feels to lose everything." With that, he turned and walked back toward his vehicles. His men followed, their job apparently complete. Engines started, tires squealed, and within moments the mountain road was silent again except for the sound of Jonathan's ragged breathing and Mary's fading gasps. Jonathan crawled toward his wife, his body finally responding to his desperate commands. He pressed his hands against the wound in her neck, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to buy her time, trying to do anything that might keep her alive. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Mary, please, stay with me. I'm going to get you help." You're going to be okay. But even as he said the words, Jonathan knew they weren't true. He could feel Mary's life slipping away beneath his fingers, could see the light beginning to fade from her eyes. Mary's lips moved, and Jonathan leaned closer to hear her final words. I love you. Jonathan, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Always. Remember that? And then she was gone. Jonathan knelt there on the cold asphalt, holding his wife's lifeless body, and let out a scream that echoed across the mountains, the sound of pure anguish, rage, and loss that seemed to tear the very air apart. The man who had been Jonathan Ratch, successful engineer and loving husband, died on that mountain road along with his wife. What remained was something else entirely, something forged in grief and tempered by injustice. Something that would not rest until the scales were balanced. Chapter 2. Jonathan awakens. Consciousness returned to Jonathan in fragments, like pieces of a shattered mirror slowly reassembling themselves into a coherent reflection. First came the pain, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from every cell in his body. Then the cold, the mountain air had turned bitter as the sun began to set, and the asphalt beneath him had long since stolen what warmth remained in his limbs. But it was the smell that truly brought him back, the metallic scent of blood, thick and cloying in the still air. Jonathan's eyes snapped open, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back like a dam bursting, the roadblock, Morrison's cold smile, the sound of gunfire, Mary's scream. Mary! Jonathan pushed himself up on his elbows, his body protesting every movement. The pain in his chest and legs was intense, but manageable. The body armor had done its job, absorbing most of the kinetic energy from Morrison's bullets. He would have bruises that would last for weeks, possibly some cracked ribs, but he was alive. Unlike Mary. She lay beside him on the asphalt, her honey-blonde hair fanned out around her head like a halo. Her eyes were closed, her face peaceful in a way that made Jonathan's heart break all over again. The dark stain on her dress had spread and dried, and when Jonathan reached out to touch her neck, her skin was cold and still. No, he whispered, his voice cracking. No, no, no. Mary, please. Please come back to me. He pulled her body into his arms, cradling her against his chest, feeling the terrible weight of her lifelessness. The woman who had been his partner, his confidant, his anchor in a world that often seemed to move too fast, she was gone. The brilliant mind that had helped him solve impossible problems, the gentle hands that had soothed his fears, the voice that had whispered, I love you, every morning for 5 years, all of it silenced forever. I'm sorry, Jonathan sobbed, his tears falling onto Mary's face. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I should have protected you. I should have seen this coming. I should have, but there was no should have anymore. There was only what was, and what was a world where Morrison had won, where good people died while monsters walked free, where justice was a commodity to be bought and sold by the highest bidder. Jonathan held Mary for what felt like hours, until the last of the daylight faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear. Only then did he gently lay her body back down on the asphalt and force himself to stand. His legs shook beneath him, partly from the physical trauma and partly from the emotional devastation, but he remained upright. He looked down at the Aston Martin, its pristine paint job now spattered with blood and road dust. The car that had been a symbol of their success, their partnership, their dreams for the future, now it was just another piece of evidence in a crime that would never be properly investigated. Jonathan pulled out his phone with trembling fingers and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was professional, distant. My wife is dead, Jonathan said, his voice hollow. My wife has been murdered. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights, uniforms, and clipboards. Sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed by the coroner, then the state police. Jonathan answered their questions as best he could, but he could see in their eyes that they didn't believe him. A roadblock. Armed men. Frank Morrison, who was supposed to be in federal prison. Mr. Ratch, said Detective Sarah Chen, a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I understand you've been through a terrible trauma, but I need you to think carefully about what you're telling us. You're saying that Frank Morrison, who according to our records, is currently serving time in federal prison, orchestrated an ambush on this road. I'm telling you exactly what happened, Jonathan replied, his voice steady despite the exhaustion and grief that threatened to overwhelm him. Morrison was here. He had at least 6 men with him, all armed. He shot me first, then he shot Mary. Detective Chen glanced at her partner, Detective Mike Torres, a heavy-set man with gray at his temples. Jonathan caught the look and felt a cold pit form in his stomach. Mr. Ratch, Torres said gently, we've already checked with the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Frank Morrison is exactly where he's supposed to be, in his cell at USP Lewisburg. He's been there all day. That's impossible, Jonathan insisted. I saw him. I talked to him. He's the one who, sir, Chen interrupted. I know this is difficult, but we need to consider other possibilities. You were in a serious car accident. You sustained significant trauma to your head and body. Sometimes, in situations like that, the mind can play tricks on us. Jonathan stared at them in disbelief. A car accident? Detective, look at the bullet holes in my suit. Look at the wounds on my wife's body. Does that look like a car accident to you? Chen and Torres exchanged another glance. Jonathan could practically see the thoughts passing between them. Traumatized husband, probably in shock, creating an elaborate fantasy to cope with a terrible loss. Mr. Ratch, Chen said carefully, we'll investigate every aspect of this incident. But I need you to understand that what you're describing, a military-style ambush by a man who's currently in federal custody, well, it strains credibility. Then check the federal records again, Jonathan snapped. Call the prison. Verify that Morrison is actually in his cell. Check the security footage, the visitor logs, anything. Because I'm telling you, Frank Morrison was here tonight, and he murdered my wife. We'll do that, Torres assured him. But in the meantime, I need to ask, did you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt you or your wife? Business rivals, perhaps? Jonathan almost laughed, but the sound that came out was bitter and hollow. Detective, I'm one of the most successful defense contractors in the country. I have more enemies than I can count. But Morrison is the only one who would go this far. Why Morrison specifically? Chen asked. Because I put him in prison 3 years ago, Jonathan replied. I provided evidence that he was stealing technology from smaller companies and bribing procurement officers. He swore he'd get revenge. And now you believe he's carried out that threat, Torres said. I don't believe it, Jonathan corrected. I know it. I watched him murder my wife. But even as he said the words, Jonathan could see that the detectives weren't buying his story. They were treating him like a victim, not a witness. A traumatized husband who needed sympathy and psychological help, not justice. Mr. Ratch, Chen said gently, we're going to need you to come to the station to give a formal statement. And I'd like to recommend that you speak with someone, a counselor or therapist. What you've been through tonight, losing your wife in such a violent way. It's going to take time to process. Jonathan nodded numbly. He could see there was no point in arguing further. The detectives had already made up their minds about what had happened here. In their version of events, Mary had died in a car accident, and Jonathan's traumatized mind had invented an elaborate conspiracy to explain the inexplicable. As the coroner's team prepared to take Mary's body away, Jonathan knelt beside the gurney one last time. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and leaned down to kiss her cold lips. "I'm going to make this right," he whispered. "I promise you, Mary. I'm going to find a way to make this right." The formal investigation lasted exactly 2 weeks. During that time, Jonathan watched in growing frustration as the authorities went through the motions of looking for evidence while clearly believing none would be found. The forensics team found no trace of Morrison or his men. The bullet holes in Jonathan's suit were dismissed as damage from the accident. The wound in Mary's neck was attributed to a piece of twisted metal from the car's wreckage. The entire incident was classified as a single-vehicle accident, with Mrs. Mary Ratch listed as the sole fatality. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Ratch," Detective Chen said when she called to inform him that the case was being closed. "I know this isn't the outcome you were hoping for, but sometimes these things just don't have the answers we want." Jonathan hung up the phone without responding. He stood in his workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that had once brought him such joy, and felt the last of his faith in the system die. He pulled out his phone and dialed another number, one that he hadn't used in months. "Henderson," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Jim, it's Jonathan Ratch. I need a favor." James Henderson was a former FBI agent who now worked as a private investigator. He'd helped Jonathan gather evidence against Morrison 3 years ago, and Jonathan trusted him more than any cop or federal agent. "Jonathan," Henderson's voice softened. "I heard about Mary. I'm so sorry, man. How are you holding up?" "I'm not," Jonathan replied honestly. "Jim, I need you to check something for me. Discreetly. I need to know if Frank Morrison was really in prison 2 weeks ago." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Jonathan, the police are idiots," Jonathan cut him off. "Or they are being paid not to look too hard. Jim, Morrison killed Mary. He killed her right in front of me, and now he's going to get away with it unless we can prove he was there." Henderson sighed. "All right. I'll make some calls. But Jonathan, you need to be prepared for the possibility that the official records are correct. Morrison might really have been in prison. Then find out how he got out," Jonathan said. "Find out who helped him, who paid for it, who covered it up. Because I'm telling you, Jim, Frank Morrison murdered my wife, and I'm going to prove it." After he hung up the phone, Jonathan walked to the window of his workshop and looked out at the mountains where Mary had died. Somewhere out there, Morrison was probably laughing about how easy it had been. How he'd managed to destroy Jonathan's life and get away with it completely. But Morrison had made one crucial mistake. He'd left Jonathan alive. And Jonathan Ratch was not the kind of man who gave up easily. If the system wouldn't give him justice, then he would create his own. Jonathan walked to a locked cabinet in the corner of his workshop and pulled out a set of blueprints he'd been working on for years, a project he'd never quite had the courage to complete. The plans showed a suit of armor unlike anything the world had ever seen, powered by revolutionary technology, and capable of things that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. He'd called it the Tornado Project, a theoretical design for a suit that could manipulate air currents and create devastating weather effects. It was the kind of technology that governments would kill for, the kind of weapon that could change the balance of power in the world. Jonathan had always intended it as a defensive system, something to protect soldiers in combat or rescue workers in disaster zones. But now, looking at the plans with new eyes, he could see other possibilities. He could see justice. "I'm going to make this right, Mary," he whispered to the empty workshop. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. I'm going to make sure Frank Morrison pays for what he did to you. And I'm going to make sure no one else ever has to go through what we went through." Jonathan spread the blueprints out on his workbench and began to study them with the intensity of a man who had found his purpose. The grief was still there, sharp and terrible, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel for the fire that would forge him into something new, something dangerous, something that could bring justice to a world that had forgotten what the word meant. Frank Morrison had taken everything from him. But in doing so, he had also freed Jonathan from the constraints of law and morality that had held him back for so long. Morrison had created his own nemesis. He just didn't know it yet. The transformation of Jonathan Ratch had begun. Chapter 3, Tornado Suit Mark I is born. The basement laboratory of the Ratch estate had always been Jonathan's sanctuary, but in the weeks following Mary's funeral, it became something else entirely, a forge where grief was transformed into purpose, where loss was alchemized into power. Jonathan had barely slept since the memorial service. He couldn't bear to lie in the bed he'd shared with Mary, couldn't stand the silence of rooms that still held the echo of her laughter. Instead, he lived in the lab, surviving on protein bars and caffeine, while he threw himself into the most ambitious project of his career. The Tornado Project had been a theoretical exercise for years, an intellectual challenge that occupied his mind during quiet moments between more practical endeavors. The basic concept was sound, use rotating aerodynamic blades to generate controlled vortex patterns, creating a personal atmospheric manipulation system. But the engineering challenges had always seemed insurmountable. Not anymore. Computer, display Tornado Project files, Jonathan said to the lab's AI system as he stood before the massive holographic display that dominated one wall of the workspace. Displaying Tornado Project Mark I schematics, the system responded in its neutral feminine voice. Warning: project classification is theoretical conceptual. No prototype has been constructed. That's about to change, Jonathan muttered, studying the three-dimensional blueprints that materialized in the air before him. The design was elegant in its complexity, a full-body exoskeleton built around a carbon nanotube frame, with 4 massive aerodynamic blades extending from a central rotational hub. The user would be positioned at the eye of the storm, protected by multiple layers of armor while the spinning blades generated winds powerful enough to level buildings. It was a weapon disguised as protective equipment. Or perhaps it was protective equipment that could function as a weapon. Jonathan was no longer sure there was a difference. Computer, begin manufacturing analysis for all components, he commanded. I want a full material requirements list, fabrication timeline, and testing protocols. Processing. Analysis complete. Estimated project timeline, 14 months with current equipment limitations. Warning: several components exceed safe operational parameters for civilian use. Override safety warnings, Jonathan said without hesitation. Authorization: Jonathan Ratch, CEO and Chief Engineer. This is a classified military development project. Safety overrides accepted. Updating manufacturing analysis. Jonathan rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The first challenge was the core exoskeleton. Jonathan had experimented with carbon nanotube composites for years, but the Tornado suit required something beyond anything he'd previously created. The frame would need to withstand forces that would tear apart conventional armor while remaining light enough for a human operator to wear. Working 18-hour days, Jonathan developed a new manufacturing process that layered carbon nanotubes in a specific weave pattern, creating a structure that was simultaneously flexible and nearly indestructible. The breakthrough came when he realized he could use the same principles that made spider silk so strong, long molecular chains arranged in both crystalline and amorphous regions. Mary would have loved this, he whispered to himself as he watched the molecular printer lay down the first layers of the exoskeleton frame. She'd always been fascinated by biomimicry, the way nature solved engineering problems that stumped human designers. The thought of his wife brought a familiar stab of pain, but Jonathan pushed it aside and focused on the work. Pain was fuel now. Grief was motivation. Every component he built was a step closer to justice. The rotational system presented the next major challenge. Jonathan needed bearings that could spin at nearly 10,000 RPM, while supporting massive aerodynamic loads. Conventional ball bearings would disintegrate under those forces, and even the best magnetic bearings weren't designed for the extreme conditions the suit would generate. The solution came from an unexpected source, a research paper on superconducting magnetic levitation that Mary had shown him months before her death. By using ceramic superconductors cooled with liquid nitrogen, Jonathan could create a bearing system that would allow the blades to float in a perfect magnetic field, with virtually no friction or wear. "You're still helping me, aren't you?" Jonathan said softly as he calibrated the magnetic field generators. He could almost hear Mary's voice, guiding him through the complex calculations, sharing in the joy of discovery that had always been their greatest bond. The blade design itself required months of experimentation. Each blade needed to be aerodynamically perfect, capable of moving massive volumes of air while remaining stable at extreme rotational speeds. Jonathan tested dozens of configurations in the lab's wind tunnel, refining the shape with each iteration. The final design was a work of art, a 1.2-meter aerodynamic blade with a modified NACA airfoil profile and integrated air scoops that would channel wind through an internal tunnel network. The edges were sharpened to a molecular level using diamond nanolattice technology, creating cutting surfaces that could slice through steel. Warning, the lab computer announced as Jonathan completed the first blade prototype. Current design parameters indicate weapons-grade cutting capability. Recommend safety protocols for handling and testing. Noted, Jonathan replied, but he made no move to modify the design. The blades weren't just for generating wind, they were for cutting through anything that got in his way. The wind tunnel network was perhaps the most complex aspect of the entire suit. Jonathan designed a system of interconnected passages that would channel air through multiple stages of compression and acceleration. Primary turbines would create the initial airflow, which would then be progressively accelerated through secondary and tertiary stages, before being expelled through directional nozzles. The effect would be devastating, a controlled tornado with the user positioned safely at its center. But the most innovative aspect of the design was the kinetic energy recovery system. As the blades spun, they would drive generators that would actually charge the suit's batteries, making it more efficient the faster it operated. At optimal rotational speeds, the suit would generate more power than it consumed. "It's beautiful," Jonathan murmured as he watched the KERS system run through its first test cycle. "Mary, you should see this. We're actually harvesting energy from the storm itself." The neural interface presented unique challenges. Jonathan had experimented with brain-computer interfaces in his military contracts, but the tornado suit required something far more sophisticated. The operator would need to control not just movement, but complex atmospheric manipulation, all while experiencing forces that would overwhelm normal human reflexes. Jonathan's solution was a quantum-enhanced neural network that could interpret not just specific thoughts, but emotional states and subconscious reactions. The system would learn the operator's patterns, becoming more responsive over time. "Computer, run neural interface calibration with my baseline patterns," Jonathan instructed as he positioned the sensor array against his skull. Calibration initiated. "Please focus on basic movement intentions while maintaining emotional neutrality." Jonathan closed his eyes and visualized simple actions: walking forward, turning left, stopping. The system mapped his neural patterns, creating a baseline that would allow the suit to respond to his thoughts. Calibration complete. Neural recognition accuracy, 97.3%. System is ready for integration testing. "Good," Jonathan said, though he wondered if emotional neutrality would be possible when he finally faced Morrison. Rage might interfere with the neural interface, but it might also fuel it. He would find out soon enough. The final systems integration took place over a grueling weekend in late November, 6 months after Mary's death. Jonathan had pushed himself to the edge of exhaustion, surviving on stimulants and determination, as he connected thousands of components into a single, coherent system. The completed suit stood in the center of the lab like a mechanical god, 2 meters tall and imposing beyond anything Jonathan had ever created. The carbon nanotube frame gleamed under the lab lights, and the retracted blades gave it the appearance of some enormous, sleeping insect. Final systems check, Jonathan commanded. Running complete diagnostic. Power systems, optimal. Structural integrity, within parameters. Rotational mechanisms, ready for deployment. Neural interface, calibrated and responsive. Safety systems, all operational. Warning, suit has not undergone field testing. Recommend extensive simulation before operational deployment. Jonathan almost smiled. Computer, the simulation is going to be the real world. Begin final assembly sequence. Over the next hour, robotic arms moved with precise choreography, installing the final components, sealing joints, and conducting thousands of microcalibrations. When it was complete, the Tornado Mark I stood ready for its first test. But not here. Not in the lab where he and Mary had worked together for so many years. This machine was born from darkness, and it would be baptized in the same. Jonathan had spent weeks researching Morrison's operations, using his contacts in the defense industry to track down every facility, every asset, every person connected to Aegis defense systems. Morrison thought he was untouchable, protected by bought judges and corrupted officials. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Computer, prepare the suit for transport, Jonathan ordered. And send a message to Jim Henderson. Tell him I won't be needing his services after all. Message composition requires additional details, the computer replied. Tell him, Jonathan said, looking up at his creation, that I found another way to get justice. The custom-built transport van was a masterpiece of engineering in its own right. Jonathan had designed it to look like an ordinary delivery truck, but beneath the mundane exterior was a mobile command center equipped with everything needed to deploy and support the Tornado suit in the field. The rear compartment contained a full diagnostic suite, backup power systems, and automated equipment for suit entry and exit. The van could operate autonomously, following pre-programmed routes while Jonathan was deployed, then meeting him at predetermined extraction points. As Jonathan loaded the completed suit into the transport van, he felt a moment of doubt. Was this really what Mary would have wanted? Would she approve of what he was about to become? But then he remembered her final words, "I love you," Jonathan, spoken even as Morrison's bullets tore through her throat. She had died because the system failed to protect good people from evil ones. She had died because corruption allowed monsters like Morrison to operate with impunity. Jonathan wouldn't let that happen again. "I'm sorry, Mary," he whispered as he sealed the transport compartment. "I know this isn't who you married. But it's who I have to become." He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The first target was a weapons depot in the Nevada desert, one of Morrison's black sites, where illegal weapons were stored and tested. Intelligence suggested it was manned by some of the same mercenaries who had helped murder Mary. It was time for the Tornado Mark I to announce itself to the world. And it was time for Frank Morrison to learn that some storms couldn't be weathered, only survived. Chapter 4. Revenge Test. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a barren landscape of sand, rock, and scrub brush beneath a merciless sun. Jonathan had been driving for 18 hours straight, stopping only for fuel and brief equipment checks. The custom transport van handled the interstate highways smoothly, its specialized suspension system protecting the precious cargo in the rear compartment. Morrison's weapons depot sat 40 miles north of Las Vegas, hidden in a valley between two low mountain ridges. According to Jonathan's intelligence, it was officially listed as a mining exploration facility, but satellite imagery told a different story. The geometric patterns of buildings, the precisely aligned storage structures, and the heavy security fencing all screamed military installation. Jonathan pulled the van to a stop on a ridge overlooking the facility and activated the surveillance equipment built into the dashboard. High-definition cameras extended from hidden compartments, giving him a clear view of the target 2 miles away. "Computer, analyze facility layout and defensive positions," he commanded. "Analysis complete," the van's AI responded. "Facility contains 12 primary structures, 3 guard towers, and perimeter fencing with electronic surveillance. Personnel count: approximately 30 individuals, armed with standard military weapons. Vehicles present: 6 HUMs, 2 armored personnel carriers, 1 helicopter." Jonathan studied the readouts with the cold calculation of an engineer solving a technical problem. 30 men with conventional weapons against 1 man in an experimental suit that could generate F3 tornado winds. The math was simple. "What kind of weapons are they carrying?" Jonathan asked. "Primary armament appears to be assault rifles, likely Morrison's own M47 design. Side arms include standard military pistols. Vehicle-mounted weapons include 50 caliber machine guns and light anti-tank missiles." Jonathan almost laughed. Morrison's men were equipped to fight a conventional military engagement, not a walking natural disaster. Their bullets would be useless against the suit's armor, and their vehicles would be torn apart by 200 miles per hour winds. "Computer, initiate suit preparation sequence," Jonathan ordered. "Acknowledged. Beginning pre-deployment checklist." Jonathan moved to the rear of the van, where the Tornado Mark I waited in its deployment cradle. The suit looked even more imposing in the confined space, a giant mechanical warrior that seemed to pulse with barely contained power. The entry process was like being swallowed by a benevolent machine. Jonathan stepped into the suit through the rear access hatch, feeling the internal mechanisms guide his limbs into the proper positions. The neural interface contacts pressed against his skull, immediately beginning the synchronization process. "Neural interface online," the suit's internal computer announced in his ears. "Running system diagnostics. Power systems, 100%. Structural integrity, optimal. Rotational mechanisms, ready for deployment. Atmospheric manipulation systems, standby." Jonathan felt the hydraulic assists engage, amplifying his movements and making the massive suit feel surprisingly agile. He flexed his fingers and felt the suit's hands respond perfectly, the advanced feedback systems creating the illusion that he was simply wearing very sophisticated gloves. "Suit entry complete," he said aloud, his voice echoing slightly within the helmet. "Begin deployment sequence." The van's rear doors opened automatically, and Jonathan walked the suit down the deployment ramp. The sensation was extraordinary, despite the suit's size and weight, movement felt natural and fluid. The hydraulic systems anticipated his intentions, providing exactly the right amount of assistance for each step. Jonathan paused at the bottom of the ramp and looked toward Morrison's facility. From this distance, it looked peaceful, just another collection of buildings baking in the desert heat. The men inside had no idea that death was walking toward them. "You should have left her alone, Frank," Jonathan whispered. He began walking toward the facility, the suit's feet making surprisingly little noise on the sandy ground. The advanced shock absorption systems minimized impact vibrations, and the suit's weight was distributed across oversized foot plates that prevented sinking into soft terrain. As he approached the perimeter fence, Jonathan could see the first guard tower more clearly. A lone sentry was visible, binoculars occasionally sweeping across the desert. The man was looking for vehicles, aircraft, conventional threats. He wasn't expecting a lone figure walking across the wasteland. Jonathan stopped at the edge of the facility's sensor range and initiated the suit's startup sequence. Beginning rotational system activation, he announced to the suit's computer. Confirm safety protocols are engaged. Safety protocols confirmed. Arm locks are ready for engagement. Emergency systems are standing by. Recommend moving to minimum safe distance from obstacles before beginning rotation. Jonathan looked around. The nearest structure was still 50 meters away, more than enough clearance for what he was about to do. Engage arm locks. The sensation was unnerving but necessary. Hydraulic clamps secured Jonathan's arms against his torso, preventing them from being torn off by the centrifugal forces the suit would generate. Thick padding inflated around his limbs, cushioning him within the protective cocoon of the suit's interior. Arm locks engaged. Ready for blade deployment. Deploy blades. The transformation was magnificent and terrifying. Four massive aerodynamic blades extended from the suit's central hub with mechanical precision, each one locking into position with an audible click. The blades were works of art, curved carbon fiber surfaces that gleamed like polished obsidian, their diamond-sharp edges catching the desert sunlight. In the guard tower, the sentry suddenly straightened and raised his binoculars. "What the hell?" the man muttered, staring at the impossible sight in the distance. Jonathan could see the guard reaching for his radio, could imagine the confusion in his voice as he tried to describe what he was seeing. But it was too late for warnings now. Initiate rotational sequence, Jonathan commanded. The suit's internal systems hummed to life with a sound like distant thunder. Primary turbines began to spin, drawing air through the intake manifolds. The main rotational assembly engaged with a deep mechanical growl that Jonathan felt as much as heard. The blades began to turn. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, the four massive blades carved through the air with hypnotic grace. At 500 RPM, the suit began to vibrate slightly. At 1,000 RPM, the individual blades became a blur. At 2,000 RPM, the air itself began to sing. Rotational speed, 3,000 RPM and climbing, the suit reported. Atmospheric disturbance beginning to form. Recommend maintaining current position until vortex stabilizes. Jonathan could feel it happening, the air around him starting to move, swirling in complex patterns as the blades forced it into submission. Dust and sand began to rise from the ground, caught in the growing vortex. In the facility, alarms began to sound. Contact bearing 270 degrees. The guard tower sentry shouted into his radio. Some kind of. I don't know what the hell it is. It's spinning. It's creating a freaking tornado. Through the swirling air, Jonathan could see figures running between buildings, soldiers emerging from barracks with weapons in hand. Vehicle engines roared to life as the facility's quick reaction team mobilized against a threat they couldn't possibly understand. Rotational speed, 5,000 RPM, the suit announced. Approaching vortex threshold. Recommend override recommendations, Jonathan interrupted. Continue acceleration. Target speed, 6,800 RPM for F1 tornado generation. Warning, operator, F1 tornado generation will create severe environmental effects. Confirm intended target area. Jonathan looked toward the facility where Morrison's mercenaries were scrambling to respond to his approach. These were the same men who had helped murder Mary, who had taken payment to destroy innocent lives. They deserved what was coming. Target confirmed, he said. Initiate F1 tornado generation. The transformation was like watching a god wake up. At 6,800 RPM, the spinning blades achieved the critical threshold where physics took over and nature itself became a weapon. The vortex that had been forming around Jonathan suddenly coalesced into something magnificent and terrible, a genuine tornado, 20 meters tall and growing. Sand, dust, and debris were sucked into the whirling column of air, creating a brown and gray shroud that concealed Jonathan at its center. But the suit's sensors cut through the chaos, painting a clear tactical picture on his helmet display. F1 tornado achieved, the suit announced with what sounded almost like pride. Wind speeds, 95 miles per hour and climbing. Atmospheric pressure differential, stable. Operator safety, optimal. Jonathan felt a moment of pure exhilaration. It worked. All the theory, all the engineering, all the months of desperate work, it actually worked. He was standing at the eye of a tornado that he controlled, wielding the fury of nature itself as a weapon. Increase to F2 intensity, he commanded. I want 150 miles per hour winds. Acknowledged. Increasing rotational speed to 7,800 RPM. The tornado grew stronger, taller, more destructive. Jonathan could hear the roar of wind mixing with the mechanical howl of the suit systems, creating a symphony of controlled chaos. Through his helmet display, he could see the terror on the faces of Morrison's men as they realized what was bearing down on them. Some of them were firing their weapons now, muzzle flashes visible through the swirling debris. But their bullets were swept away by the wind before they could reach their target, and they couldn't even see Jonathan through the shroud of sand and dust. Beginning approach, Jonathan announced, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the suit's computer or to Mary's memory. For Mary. He began walking toward the facility, and the tornado moved with him. It was like being the pilot of a natural disaster, guiding destruction with nothing more than intention and will. The fence line approached rapidly, and Jonathan watched with satisfaction as the first guard tower simply disintegrated under the assault of 150 miles per hour winds. The sentry who had spotted him tried to jump clear, but the tornado caught him and flung him 200 meters into the desert. Jonathan felt no satisfaction in the man's death, it was simply a mathematical result, cause and effect, action and consequence. The perimeter fence was shredded like tissue paper. Vehicle alarms wailed as cars and trucks were lifted from the ground and hurled through the air. A Humvee tumbled past Jonathan's position, its armor plating crumpled like foil. Engaging facility structures, Jonathan reported. Testing blade cutting capability. The first building he approached was a simple storage shed, probably containing ammunition or supplies. As the tornado enveloped it, Jonathan watched the suit's rotating blades slice through the metal walls like a gigantic blender. In seconds, the entire structure was reduced to flying debris. Blade system functioning optimally, the suit confirmed. Cutting performance exceeds design specifications. Jonathan moved deeper into the facility, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. Buildings collapsed, vehicles tumbled through the air, and Morrison's mercenaries fled in panic before the unstoppable force bearing down on them. Some of the soldiers tried to make a stand at the main armory, taking cover behind concrete barriers and firing everything they had at the approaching tornado. Their bullets vanished into the swirling chaos, while their position was systematically demolished by debris traveling at hurricane speeds. This is for Mary, Jonathan said quietly as he approached the final cluster of buildings. This is what justice looks like when the system fails. The main command building was built like a bunker, with reinforced concrete walls designed to withstand conventional explosives. But it wasn't designed to withstand a controlled tornado with diamond-edged cutting blades. Jonathan watched through his sensors as the building simply came apart, its walls sheared away layer by layer until the internal structure was exposed. Computers, furniture, and equipment were sucked into the vortex and destroyed, while any personnel inside were either killed instantly or flung clear of the facility. In 15 minutes, it was over. Morrison's Desert Weapons Depot had been completely destroyed, reduced to scattered debris across several square miles of Nevada wasteland. Of the 30 men who had been stationed there, Jonathan counted perhaps half a dozen survivors fleeing into the desert on foot, and those only because they had been lucky enough to be caught at the edge of the tornado's effect. Mission complete, Jonathan announced. Beginning power down sequence. Acknowledged. Reducing rotational speed. Recommend maintaining current altitude during deceleration phase. Jonathan realized he was actually flying, suspended within the tornado he had created. The suit's altimeter showed him at nearly 200 feet above the desert floor, held aloft by the same forces that had just devastated Morrison's facility. It was time to test the other new system. Computer, I want to test the emergency descent protocol. Simulate complete power failure. Warning: emergency descent from current altitude carries significant risk. Recommend controlled landing sequence instead. Override safety warnings, Jonathan commanded. I need to know the emergency systems will work when I need them. Acknowledged. Simulating complete power failure in 3, 2, 1. Now. The sensation was like falling out of the sky, which was exactly what Jonathan was doing. The suit's rotational systems shut down instantly, the tornado began to dissipate, and Jonathan found himself in free fall 200 feet above the desert. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if he had made a fatal mistake. Then the suit's emergency systems kicked in with mechanical precision. Emergency descent detected, the suit's backup computer announced. Deploying parachute system. The ballistic parachute deployment was violent and jarring, but it worked perfectly. Jonathan felt the sudden deceleration as the carbon fiber canopy deployed above him, slowing his descent to a manageable rate. He hit the ground hard but safely, the suit's impact absorption systems protecting him from injury. The parachute settled around him like a collapsed tent, and for a moment everything was quiet except for the distant sound of fires burning in the ruins of Morrison's facility. Jonathan stood up slowly, testing the suit's mobility systems. Everything functioned perfectly, the emergency descent had been as successful as the main mission. Parachute deployment successful, he reported. All systems nominal. Beginning recovery sequence. He activated the suit's beacon, and within minutes his autonomous transport van was driving across the desert toward his position. The emergency parachute was designed to be discarded, it would biodegrade completely within weeks, leaving no evidence of his presence. As Jonathan waited for pickup, he looked back toward the devastated facility. Smoke columns rose into the clear desert sky, marking the funeral pyre of Morrison's operation. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to balance the scales for Mary's death, but it was a beginning. Justice had been served, swift and terrible and absolute. When the van arrived, Jonathan climbed into the rear compartment and began the suit exit sequence. As the machine released him from its embrace, he felt oddly diminished, as if he were shedding some essential part of himself. But that was for later. Right now, he needed to get clear of the area before the authorities arrived to investigate what would surely be classified as the most unusual natural disaster in Nevada history. Jonathan climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. As the van pulled away from the destruction site, he allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Frank Morrison had taken his wife, his happiness, his faith in justice. But Morrison had also created something far more dangerous than he could possibly imagine, a man with unlimited resources, advanced technology, and nothing left to lose. The Tornado Mark I had passed its field test with flying colors. Now it was time to plan the next phase of Jonathan's campaign. Morrison himself was still out there somewhere, probably feeling safe behind his wall of corrupted officials and bought protection. But no wall could withstand the storm that was coming for him. Jonathan Ratch was no longer just a grieving widower seeking justice. He had become something else entirely, a force of nature with a human heart and an engineer's precision. And Frank Morrison was about to learn that some storms couldn't be escaped, only endured. The hunt was just beginning. The Winds of Justice Chapters 5 to 6. Chapter 5. A natural disaster. Frank Morrison's helicopter circled the devastation twice before he could bring himself to order the pilot to land. What had been his most secure weapons facility just 48 hours ago was now a field of scattered debris stretching across miles of Nevada desert. From the air, it looked like the aftermath of a nuclear strike, buildings reduced to twisted metal and concrete fragments, vehicles flung hundreds of yards from their original positions, even the reinforced bunkers torn apart and scattered to the winds. Jesus Christ, Morrison whispered, pressing his face against the helicopter's window. What the hell happened here? The pilot, a former military man named Rodriguez, who had worked for Morrison for 3 years, shook his head in disbelief. Sir, I've seen tornado damage before, but nothing like this. The debris pattern is all wrong. It's too precise. Morrison nodded grimly. Rodriguez was right, the destruction was too organized, too complete. Natural tornadoes left chaotic destruction in their wake, with some buildings damaged and others miraculously untouched. This looked like the work of someone who had methodically demolished every structure on the site. Set us down near what's left of the command center, Morrison ordered. I need to see this up close. The helicopter touched down on a patch of cleared ground that had once been the facility's main parking area. Morrison climbed out, his expensive suit jacket whipping in the rotor wash, and surveyed the destruction with the eye of a man who had built his fortune on understanding weapons and their effects. This was wrong. All wrong. Morrison had spent 2 decades in the defense contracting business, and he'd seen the aftermath of every type of conventional weapon known to man. Artillery strikes, missile impacts, controlled demolitions, even legitimate tornado damage, he'd studied them all. But this was something else entirely. The metal debris showed signs of having been cut with incredible precision. Steel beams that should have been bent or twisted by wind forces had instead been sliced through cleanly, as if by some massive blade. The concrete foundations weren't just broken, they were pulverized, ground to powder by forces that conventional meteorology couldn't explain. Sir. Rodriguez approached cautiously, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Maybe we should get back to the chopper. This place gives me the creeps. Morrison ignored him, walking deeper into the destruction zone. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what could have caused this level of devastation. The insurance investigators had already been here, along with representatives from the National Weather Service. Their preliminary report concluded that a freak tornado had struck the facility, a statistical anomaly, but not unprecedented in the region. But Morrison knew better. He'd chosen this location specifically because it was outside the normal tornado corridor. The geological and meteorological conditions here made severe weather events extremely unlikely. And even if a tornado had struck, it wouldn't have caused this type of damage. No, this was the work of a weapon. A weapon unlike anything Morrison had ever seen. Sir. Rodriguez called from behind him. You need to see this. Morrison turned to see his pilot standing near what had once been the facility's main gate, holding something in his hands. As Morrison approached, he could see it was fabric, some kind of high-tech material that shimmered in the desert sunlight. It's a parachute, Rodriguez explained. Found it caught on what's left of the fence line. But look at this, there's writing on it. Morrison took the parachute canopy and examined it closely. The material was unlike anything he'd seen before, some kind of carbon fiber weave that was incredibly light, but obviously strong enough to support significant weight. The construction was military grade, but the design was too advanced for any parachute system he knew about. And there, stenciled in small black letters near the edge of the canopy, were two words that made Morrison's blood run cold. For Mary Morrison stared at the inscription, his mind reeling. It couldn't be. Jonathan Ratch was supposed to be dead, killed in the same attack that had taken his wife. Morrison had received confirmation from his sources that both targets had been eliminated. But if Jonathan had somehow survived? Sir. Rodriguez was looking at him with concern. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Morrison carefully folded the parachute and tucked it under his arm. We're leaving. Now. What about the investigation? The insurance people said, fuck the insurance people, Morrison snapped. Get us back to Vegas. I need to make some calls. The flight back to Las Vegas took 30 minutes, but Morrison's mind was already racing ahead to the implications of what he'd discovered. If Jonathan Ratch was alive, if he had somehow developed the technology to create artificial tornadoes, then Morrison was facing a threat unlike anything he'd ever encountered. As soon as the helicopter touched down at McCarran Airport, Morrison was on his encrypted satellite phone, calling his most trusted contacts in law enforcement and intelligence. Detective Chen. It's Frank Morrison. I need you to pull everything you have on the Jonathan Ratch case from last year. What do you mean the case is closed? I don't give a damn if it's closed. I want every file, every report, every photograph. Yes, I'll make it worth your while. Morrison's next call was to a private investigator named Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent who specialized in industrial espionage. Webb had worked for Morrison before, handling sensitive matters that required absolute discretion. Webb, I need you to find out everything you can about Jonathan Ratch. I want to know where he is, what he's doing, who he's talking to. I don't care what it costs. And Webb. This is priority 1. Drop everything else. The third call was to Morrison's head of security, a former Delta Force operator named Colonel James Haskins. Haskins ran Morrison's personal protection detail and oversaw security for all of Morrison's legitimate businesses. Colonel, we have a problem. I need you to upgrade security at all our facilities immediately. Triple the guard rotations, install additional surveillance equipment, and arm everyone with the new M47s. No, this isn't a drill. We're dealing with a credible threat. Morrison's final call was to a number that very few people had access to, the private line of Senator Robert Whitmore, chairman of the Senate Defense Appropriations Committee. Whitmore had been on Morrison's payroll for years, providing inside information on defense contracts and helping to smooth over regulatory issues. Senator, it's Frank. I need a favor. Yes, I know what time it is. This is important. I need you to check with your contacts at the Pentagon. Find out if there are any black projects involving weather manipulation or atmospheric control systems. I don't care if it's classified. I need to know. When Morrison finally hung up the phone, he was sitting in the back of his armored Mercedes, being driven through the neon-lit streets of Las Vegas toward his penthouse suite at the Bellagio. But his mind was thousands of miles away, trying to piece together the puzzle of Jonathan Ratch's apparent resurrection. The parachute was the key. Morrison had it with him now, secured in a briefcase that never left his side. The material was too advanced for any civilian manufacturer, and the construction suggested military or aerospace origins. But the inscription, "For Mary," that was personal. That was a message. Jonathan Ratch was alive, and he was coming for revenge. Morrison's penthouse suite occupied the entire top floor of the Bellagio, with panoramic views of the Las Vegas Strip and the surrounding desert. It was a fortress of luxury, with bulletproof windows, reinforced walls, and a sophisticated security system that could detect threats from miles away. But as Morrison stood on his balcony, looking out at the lights of the city, he felt more vulnerable than he had in years. "Sir." Colonel Haskins appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim with concern. "I've implemented the security upgrades you requested. All facilities are now on high alert, and I've doubled the guard details at your primary residences." Morrison nodded without turning around. "What about the research into weather manipulation technology?" "I've reached out to my contacts in the special operations community," Haskins replied. "There are rumors of experimental programs, but nothing concrete. The Pentagon is being unusually tight-lipped about atmospheric research projects. And the private investigator Webb is working on it. He's already confirmed that Jonathan Ratch is alive and apparently living in his mansion outside Denver. But the property is heavily secured, and Webb hasn't been able to get close enough for detailed surveillance." Morrison finally turned to face his security chief. Haskins was a good man, loyal, competent, and absolutely ruthless when necessary. But he was also a conventional thinker, trained to deal with conventional threats. What Morrison was facing now was anything but conventional. "Colonel, I want you to understand something," Morrison said quietly. "Jonathan Ratch isn't just another disgruntled former business partner. He's a genius, one of the most brilliant engineers alive. If he's developed some kind of weather control technology, then we're dealing with a threat that could destroy everything we've built." Haskins nodded grimly. "What are your orders, sir?" Morrison walked back into the suite and poured himself a glass of single malt whiskey. He'd built his empire through ruthless calculation and careful planning, but now he was facing an enemy who seemed to operate outside the normal rules of engagement. "I want you to contact Victor Kozlov," Morrison said finally. "Tell him I need his special services." Haskins raised an eyebrow. Victor Kozlov was a former Spetsnaz operative who now worked as a freelance assassin for clients who could afford his extremely high fees. Morrison had used his services twice before, both times to eliminate competitors who had become inconvenient. "Sir, are you sure that's wise? Kozlov's methods tend to be messy." "Messy is exactly what I need right now," Morrison replied. "Jonathan Ratch has declared war on me. He destroyed my facility and killed 30 of my men. I'm not going to sit here and wait for him to strike again." Morrison walked to a wall safe hidden behind a painting and retrieved a thick envelope filled with cash. "Give this to Kozlov as a down payment. Tell him I want Jonathan Ratch eliminated within the week. And Colonel, make sure Kozlov understands that this is a priority target. I don't care what it costs." Haskins took the envelope and nodded. "Consider it done, sir." After Haskins left, Morrison stood alone in his penthouse, staring out at the glittering lights of Las Vegas. He'd worked too hard and come too far to let Jonathan Ratch destroy everything he'd built. The engineer might have technology that seemed impossible, but Morrison had resources that money could buy and connections that reached into the highest levels of government. It was going to be a war, and Morrison intended to win. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away in Denver, Jonathan Ratch was making his own preparations for the escalating conflict. The basement laboratory of his mansion had been transformed into a combination workshop and command center, with multiple workstations dedicated to upgrading and refining the Tornado Mark I suit. The Nevada test had revealed several areas where the suit's performance could be improved. The rotational bearing system had performed flawlessly, but Jonathan had identified ways to increase efficiency and reduce power consumption. The wind tunnel network had exceeded design specifications, but there were opportunities to optimize airflow and increase thrust output. Computer, display post-mission analysis for Nevada deployment, Jonathan commanded as he stood before the holographic display system. Displaying comprehensive performance analysis, the AI responded. Overall mission success rate, 100%. Primary objectives achieved with 0 mechanical failures. Identified optimization opportunities, 17 categories. Jonathan studied the data streaming across the display. The suit had consumed 34% of its battery capacity during the 15-minute engagement, which was well within acceptable parameters. The KERS system had recovered 8% of the energy expended, proving the viability of the kinetic energy recovery concept. But there were areas for improvement. The neural interface had experienced minor latency issues during high-stress combat situations. The suit's mobility could be enhanced with upgraded hydraulic systems. And the emergency parachute system, while functional, could be made more reliable. Begin optimization protocols for all identified systems, Jonathan ordered. Priority sequence, neural interface responsiveness, hydraulic system efficiency, emergency system redundancy. As the computer began processing the upgrades, Jonathan walked to a workbench where he'd been designing a new deployment system. The Nevada mission had proven the suit's effectiveness, but it had also revealed tactical limitations. The ground-based approach had worked well in the desert, but it wouldn't be practical for all target scenarios. Jonathan needed a way to deploy the suit from altitude, allowing him to strike targets quickly and retreat before enemy forces could respond. The solution was elegant in its simplicity, a custom-built aircraft capable of vertical takeoff and landing, equipped with systems to deploy the tornado suit at high altitude. The aircraft design was already taking shape on his workbench, a sleek, angular craft that looked more like a piece of modern art than a military vehicle. It would be powered by advanced ion propulsion systems, making it virtually silent and nearly invisible to radar. The cargo bay would be specifically designed to house the tornado suit and its deployment systems. Computer, run aerodynamic analysis on VTOL aircraft design revision 7, Jonathan commanded. Analysis complete. Design shows 94% aerodynamic efficiency at cruise speed. Vertical lift capability, sufficient for maximum payload. Stealth characteristics, excellent. Estimated construction time, 6 weeks with current fabrication capabilities. Jonathan smiled grimly. 6 weeks to build an aircraft that would revolutionize tactical deployment. The defense contractors would spend years and billions of dollars trying to duplicate what he could create in his basement workshop. Begin fabrication of VTOL aircraft components, he ordered. And initiate planning protocols for next target selection. Jonathan had spent considerable time researching Morrison's network of facilities and operations. The Nevada site had been a relatively minor target, the testing facility, with minimal strategic value. But Morrison had other installations, including a primary research facility in Montana where his stolen technology was reverse-engineered and weaponized. That would be Jonathan's next target. Computer, display intelligence analysis for Morrison's Montana facility. The holographic display shifted to show satellite imagery of a compound nestled in the Rocky Mountains. Unlike the Nevada site, this facility was heavily fortified, with multiple layers of security and a substantial garrison of military contractors. Facility designation, Blackrock Research Station, the computer reported. Personnel count, approximately 200 individuals. Security level, maximum. Weapon systems, advanced anti-aircraft defenses, armored vehicles, heavy machine gun emplacements. Jonathan studied the imagery with professional interest. Morrison had clearly learned from the Nevada attack, upgrading his security and preparing for another assault. But Morrison was still thinking conventionally, preparing to defend against conventional threats. He had no idea what Jonathan was really capable of. Computer, begin tactical analysis for aerial deployment scenario. Target, complete facility destruction. Acceptable casualty parameters, all personnel considered hostile combatants. Analysis initiated. Estimated completion time, 4 hours. Jonathan turned away from the display and walked to a memorial wall he'd constructed in one corner of the laboratory. Photographs of Mary covered the wall, Mary laughing at their wedding, Mary working in the lab, Mary sleeping peacefully in their bed. In the center of the display was the final photograph he'd taken of her, just hours before Morrison's attack. "I'm getting closer, sweetheart," Jonathan whispered to the photographs. "Morrison's running scared now. He knows I'm coming for him." Jonathan had intercepted communications from Morrison's organization indicating that additional security measures were being implemented at all facilities. The arms dealer was mobilizing his resources, calling in favors, and preparing for war. Good. Jonathan wanted Morrison to be afraid. He wanted him to understand what it felt like to lose everything you'd worked for, to watch your life's work destroyed by forces beyond your control. Computer, what's the status on the neural interface optimization? Optimization complete. Neural response time improved by 23%. Command recognition accuracy increased to 99.7%. Emotional stress compensation algorithms updated based on combat data. Excellent. And the hydraulic system upgrades. Fabrication 67% complete. New systems will provide 40% increase in mobility response and 28% reduction in power consumption. Jonathan nodded with satisfaction. Each upgrade made the suit more effective, more dangerous, more capable of delivering the justice that Morrison so richly deserved. "I will not stop, Mary, until I make this right and avenge your death," Jonathan said quietly to the memorial wall. "Morrison took you from me, but is about to learn that some debts can only be paid in blood." Jonathan returned to his workbench and began sketching improvements to the suit's weapons systems. The cutting blades had performed magnificently in Nevada, but he could make them even more effective. The wind tunnel network could be optimized for greater air compression. The power systems could be enhanced to support longer operational periods. Each modification was a step closer to perfect justice. Each upgrade brought him closer to the moment when Frank Morrison would pay the ultimate price for Mary's death. In his penthouse in Las Vegas, Morrison was preparing for war with conventional weapons and conventional thinking. But Jonathan was preparing something else entirely, a storm of vengeance that would make the Nevada attack look like a gentle breeze. The hunt was accelerating, and Morrison's time was running out. Chapter 6. Vengeance. Frank Morrison stood in the war room of his private security compound outside Las Vegas, studying satellite imagery of his remaining facilities, with the grim intensity of a general planning a campaign. The walls were lined with monitors displaying real-time feeds from security cameras at installations across the western United States, each one now fortified like a military base. Status report, Morrison commanded as Colonel Haskins entered the room. "All facilities are now at maximum security alert," Haskins replied, consulting a tablet. "I've tripled the guard rotations and installed additional surveillance equipment at every site. The Montana facility now has surface-to-air missile systems, and I've positioned armored vehicles at strategic points around the perimeter." Morrison nodded approvingly. The Montana facility, Blackrock Research Station, was his crown jewel, the place where his most advanced weapons were developed and tested. If Jonathan Ratch was planning another attack, that would be the logical target. "What about the new personnel?" Morrison asked. "I've brought in an additional 50 mercenaries, all with special operations backgrounds. They're armed with our latest M47 assault rifles, and have been briefed on the unconventional nature of the threat. Morrison almost smiled at that. Unconventional was an understatement. How do you brief soldiers on fighting a man who could create tornadoes? How do you prepare for an enemy who could appear out of the sky like a force of nature? Sir, Haskins continued, I have to ask, are you sure we shouldn't contact federal authorities? If Ratch has developed some kind of weather control technology, this could be a matter of national security. Morrison shook his head firmly. Absolutely not. Too many questions, too much attention. Besides, half the federal agencies are compromised by bleeding heart liberals, who would probably want to study Ratch's technology, instead of stopping him. The truth was more complicated. Morrison's operations existed in a legal gray area, selling weapons to clients who couldn't always pass government background checks. The last thing he needed was federal investigators poking around his facilities, asking inconvenient questions about his business practices. What about Kozlov? Morrison asked, changing the subject. Haskins's expression darkened. He's in position. Kozlov and his team have been conducting surveillance on the Ratch mansion for 3 days. They are ready to move on your command. Morrison considered this. Viktor Kozlov was expensive, but he was also extremely effective. The former Spetsnaz operative had eliminated targets that conventional assassins couldn't touch, using methods that were as creative as they were lethal. Tell him to wait, Morrison decided. I want to see what Ratch does next. If he attacks Montana, we'll have a better idea of his capabilities. Then Kozlov can move in for the kill. Haskins nodded and left the room, leaving Morrison alone with his thoughts and his monitors. The arms dealer poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled into his command chair, preparing for what he suspected would be a long night. Morrison had built his empire by understanding his enemies and exploiting their weaknesses. Jonathan Ratch was brilliant, but he was also emotional, driven by grief and rage over his wife's death. That made him predictable in some ways, even if his technology was revolutionary. Ratch would come for the Montana facility. Morrison was certain of it. And when he did, Morrison would be ready with a reception that would make the Nevada attack look like a minor skirmish. 2,000 miles away, Jonathan was putting the finishing touches on his aerial deployment system. The VTOL aircraft sat in a custom-built hangar beneath his mansion, its sleek form gleaming under the bright work lights. The craft was a masterpiece of engineering, nearly invisible to radar, whisper quiet in flight, and capable of deploying the tornado suit from high altitude with pinpoint precision. Computer, run final systems check on deployment aircraft, Jonathan commanded. All systems nominal, the AI responded. Ion propulsion, optimal. Stealth characteristics, within design parameters. Cargo deployment system, ready for operation. Estimated flight time to Montana target, 4 hours, 17 minutes. Jonathan nodded with satisfaction. The aircraft would allow him to strike Morrison's facility and retreat before enemy forces could respond. The improved suit would be even more effective than the Nevada prototype, with enhanced power systems and upgraded cutting capabilities. Initiate final suit preparation sequence, Jonathan ordered. I want to be airborne within the hour. As the laboratory's robotic systems began preparing the tornado suit for deployment, Jonathan reviewed the intelligence he'd gathered on Morrison's Montana facility. Blackrock Research Station was heavily fortified, with multiple layers of security and advanced defensive systems. Morrison had clearly learned from the Nevada attack, upgrading his defenses and preparing for another assault. But Morrison was still thinking conventionally, preparing to defend against conventional threats. Anti-aircraft missiles were useless against a target that could drop out of the sky like a thunderbolt. Armored vehicles couldn't withstand 200 miles per hour winds. And all the soldiers in the world couldn't fight an enemy they couldn't see through the chaos of an artificial tornado. Computer, display final tactical analysis for Montana deployment. The holographic display showed a three-dimensional model of the target facility, with attack vectors and defensive positions marked in different colors. Jonathan had identified the optimal approach, a high-altitude deployment that would put him directly over the facility's central command structure. Mission parameters confirmed, the computer reported. Deployment altitude, 2,000 meters. Expected target engagement time, 18 minutes. Estimated facility destruction, 97% probability. Jonathan smiled grimly. Morrison had killed Mary, destroyed his faith in justice, and forced him to become something he'd never wanted to be. But in doing so, Morrison had also created his own nemesis, a man with unlimited resources, revolutionary technology, and nothing left to lose. Begin aircraft startup sequence, Jonathan commanded. It's time to teach Morrison that some storms can't be weathered. The VTOL aircraft lifted off from Jonathan's hidden hangar with barely a whisper, its ion propulsion systems providing smooth, silent thrust. Jonathan sat in the pilot's seat, monitoring flight systems while the autopilot guided the craft toward its target. Behind him, the tornado suit waited in its deployment cradle, fully charged and ready for combat. The flight to Montana took just over 4 hours, the aircraft cruising at high altitude to avoid detection by civilian air traffic control. Jonathan used the time to review his mission planning and run through deployment procedures one final time. Computer, display real-time surveillance of target facility. The aircraft's advanced sensors painted a detailed picture of Blackrock Research Station. Morrison had indeed upgraded his security. Jonathan could see armored vehicles positioned around the perimeter, guard towers with heavy weapons, and what appeared to be surface-to-air missile launchers. Threat assessment, significant conventional defenses, the computer reported. Recommend high-altitude deployment to minimize exposure to ground-based weapons. Acknowledged, Jonathan replied. Initiate deployment sequence at 2,000 meters altitude. The aircraft's cargo bay doors opened silently, revealing the star-filled sky above the Montana mountains. Cold air rushed into the cabin as Jonathan made his final preparations, checking the suit's systems one last time, before entering the mechanical embrace of his creation. The suit entry process had become routine now, the complex sequence of steps as familiar as putting on clothes. Jonathan felt the neural interface contacts press against his skull, the hydraulic systems engage, and the suit's AI come online with its familiar electronic voice. Tornado Mark 1 systems online, the suit announced. All systems optimal. Deployment altitude, 2,000 meters. Target facility, confirmed. Operator status, ready for combat. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and grief that preceded each mission. Mary's death had created this moment, had forged him into an instrument of justice that Morrison could never have imagined. Deploy, Jonathan commanded. The suit dropped from the aircraft's cargo bay like a mechanical meteor, falling silently through the night sky toward the lights of Morrison's facility below. Jonathan felt the familiar rush of free fall, the sensation of flying without wings that never failed to exhilarate him. At 500 meters altitude, the suit systems automatically engaged the emergency parachute, slowing Jonathan's descent to a manageable rate. But this time, the parachute was designed to be jettisoned early, allowing Jonathan to complete his descent under powered flight. Parachute release in 3, 2, 1. Mark. Jonathan felt the parachute separate from the suit as he activated the rotational systems. The massive blades extended from their housing with mechanical precision, and within seconds he was surrounded by the controlled chaos of an artificial tornado. The transformation was even more dramatic at night. The spinning blades created a vortex of air that caught and scattered the facility's lights, creating a whirling column of illumination that must have been visible for miles. But at the center of the storm, Jonathan remained calm and focused, his enhanced sensors cutting through the chaos to paint a clear tactical picture. F2 tornado achieved, the suit reported. Wind speeds, 147 miles per hour. Atmospheric pressure differential, stable. Beginning final approach to target. Jonathan could see the panic spreading through Morrison's facility as guards and technicians scrambled to respond to the impossible sight bearing down on them. Alarms wailed, spotlights swiveled wildly trying to track the tornado, and vehicles raced toward defensive positions. But their conventional weapons were useless against the forces Jonathan commanded. Anti-aircraft missiles couldn't lock onto a target that was constantly moving and surrounded by chaotic air currents. Machine guns fired blindly into the vortex, their bullets swept away by hurricane-force winds. Beginning facility engagement, Jonathan announced. For Mary. The first structure to fall was a guard tower on the facility's perimeter. Jonathan watched through his sensors as the tornado struck the reinforced concrete structure, the spinning blades slicing through steel supports like a massive buzzsaw. The tower collapsed in seconds, its occupants flung hundreds of meters into the surrounding forest. Jonathan moved deeper into the facility, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. Buildings collapsed, vehicles tumbled through the air, and Morrison's mercenaries fled in terror before the unstoppable force bearing down on them. But this facility was different from the Nevada site. Morrison had prepared for this attack, and his preparations were about to be tested. Warning, the suit's AI announced. Detecting multiple missile launches from facility defensive positions. Incoming projectiles, surface-to-air missiles, estimated time to impact, 15 seconds. Jonathan smiled grimly. Morrison had learned from Nevada, but he still didn't understand what he was facing. The missiles might be able to lock onto a conventional aircraft, but they couldn't track a target that was constantly moving in 3 dimensions, surrounded by chaotic air currents. Initiate evasive maneuvers, Jonathan commanded. Increase rotation speed to F3 intensity. The tornado grew stronger, taller, more chaotic. The missiles struck the vortex, and were immediately torn apart by the violent air currents, their explosive warheads detonating harmlessly in the storm. Jonathan felt the concussions as distant vibrations, but the suit's systems remained unaffected. Missile threats neutralized, the suit reported. Continuing facility engagement. Jonathan pressed deeper into the compound, targeting the main research buildings where Morrison's stolen technology was developed. These structures were built like bunkers, with reinforced concrete walls and blast-resistant design. But they weren't designed to withstand the focused fury of an F3 tornado with diamond-edged cutting blades. The first research building simply came apart, its walls sheared away layer by layer until the internal structure was exposed. Computers, equipment, and classified documents were sucked into the vortex and destroyed, years of stolen research reduced to scattered debris in seconds. Primary research facility destroyed, Jonathan reported. Moving to secondary targets. The weapons storage bunkers were next, their reinforced doors no match for the tornado's cutting power. Jonathan watched with satisfaction as cases of ammunition and explosives were torn apart and scattered, removing another piece of Morrison's empire. But the most important target was the facility's command center, where Morrison's personnel were undoubtedly watching the destruction unfold. Jonathan approached the building with deliberate slowness, wanting its occupants to understand what was coming for them. "This is what justice looks like," Jonathan said quietly as the tornado struck the command center. "This is the price of murdering innocent people." The building's reinforced walls held for almost 30 seconds, before the sustained assault of the tornado finally breached them. Jonathan watched through his sensors as the structure collapsed, its sophisticated communications equipment and tactical displays reduced to twisted wreckage. In 18 minutes, Morrison's most important facility had been completely destroyed. The research laboratories were gone, the weapons storage was scattered across the mountainside, and the command infrastructure was in ruins. Of the facility's 200 personnel, Jonathan's sensors detected perhaps 30 survivors fleeing into the forest on foot. Mission objectives achieved, Jonathan announced. Beginning extraction sequence. The tornado began to dissipate as Jonathan reduced the suit's rotation speed, the violent winds settling into more manageable air currents. As the chaos cleared, Jonathan could see the full extent of the destruction he'd caused: miles of scattered debris, twisted metal, and smoking ruins. Morrison's crown jewel was gone, erased from existence by the fury of an artificial storm. Extraction aircraft ETA, 6 minutes, the suit reported. Recommend moving to designated pickup coordinates. Jonathan began walking toward the extraction point, the suit's heavy footsteps crushing debris beneath its weight. In the distance, he could see the lights of emergency vehicles approaching: fire trucks, ambulances, and probably law enforcement responding to reports of the impossible tornado that had struck the facility. By the time they arrived, Jonathan would be gone, vanished into the night sky aboard his stealth aircraft. The authorities would find another scene of impossible destruction, another natural disaster that defied explanation. But somewhere in Las Vegas, Frank Morrison would be watching the news reports and understanding that his enemy was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. As Jonathan's extraction aircraft descended from the night sky, its nearly silent engines barely audible above the sound of distant sirens, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 2 facilities destroyed, Morrison's research capabilities crippled, and still the arms dealer had no idea what he was really facing. Computer, initiate return flight to base, Jonathan commanded as he climbed aboard the aircraft. And begin analysis of Morrison's remaining facilities. I want target packages prepared for all of them. Acknowledged, the AI responded. Estimated time to complete target analysis, 6 hours. Jonathan settled into the pilot's seat as the aircraft lifted off, leaving the burning ruins of Blackrock Research Station behind. Through the cockpit windows, he could see the glow of fires spreading across the mountainside, marking the funeral pyre of Morrison's ambitions. But this was just the beginning. Morrison had other facilities, other operations, other pieces of the empire he'd built on stolen technology and innocent blood. Jonathan would find them all, destroy them all, until nothing remained but the man himself. And then, finally, Mary's death would be avenged. The aircraft turned east, flying silently through the night toward Denver. Behind it, the mountains of Montana burned with the light of justice served, swift and terrible and absolute. Frank Morrison was about to learn that some storms couldn't be escaped, only endured. And this storm was just getting started. The Winds of Justice Chapters 7 to 8, Final, Chapter 7, Rapid Deployment. Frank Morrison stood in his private command bunker, buried 3 stories beneath his Las Vegas compound, watching the destruction of his Montana facility unfold on multiple high-definition screens. The images were almost incomprehensible: buildings torn apart by impossible winds, vehicles flung through the air like toys, and at the center of it all, a controlled tornado that moved with deliberate, terrifying purpose. "Sir," Colonel Haskins said from behind him, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We need to evacuate. If Ratch can do this to Montana, he can do it here." Morrison shook his head, his eyes never leaving the screens. "No. Running won't solve this. Ratch won't stop until he's destroyed everything I've built. The only way to end this is to end him." "But sir, our conventional weapons are useless against—" "I know what our weapons can and can't do," Morrison snapped. "But Ratch isn't invincible. That suit of his requires enormous amounts of power. He can't maintain those wind speeds indefinitely. And sooner or later, he has to come back to ground level. Morrison turned to face his security chief, and Haskins was shocked by what he saw. The arms dealer's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and stress. The carefully maintained facade of corporate success had cracked, revealing the desperate man beneath. "Contact Kozlov," Morrison ordered. "Tell him to abort the mission at the Ratch Mansion. I want him and his team here within 6 hours. If Jonathan wants to finish this, he can come to me." Haskins hesitated. "Sir, are you sure that's wise? This compound is our most secure facility, but if Ratch brings that tornado here, then we'll be ready for him," Morrison interrupted. "I've spent the last week analyzing the footage from Nevada and Montana. I know how that tornado works now. And I know how to stop it." Morrison walked to a wall safe and retrieved a classified folder marked with military designation codes. "I've been developing this for the Pentagon, a directed energy weapon designed to disrupt atmospheric disturbances. It was supposed to be used against enemy weather modification attacks." He opened the folder, revealing technical schematics for a massive device that looked like a cross between a radar dish and a particle accelerator. The atmospheric disruption array can generate focused electromagnetic pulses that interfere with air current formation. It should be able to collapse Ratch's tornado from the inside. Haskins studied the blueprints with growing excitement. "How long to deploy?" "The prototype is already installed on the roof of this building," Morrison replied. "I had it brought online yesterday, as a precautionary measure. All we need is for Ratch to get close enough." "What about the power requirements?" "This system looks like it would need the entire output of a nuclear power plant," Morrison finished. "Which is why it can only fire once before burning out. We'll get one shot at this, Colonel. We need to make it count." 2,000 miles away, Jonathan was putting the finishing touches on his own preparations. The destruction of Morrison's Montana facility had been satisfying, but it was only a prelude to the main event. Morrison himself remained alive, and as long as he drew breath, Mary's death remained unavenged. "Computer, display real-time intelligence on Morrison's Las Vegas compound," Jonathan commanded. The holographic display showed detailed satellite imagery of Morrison's fortress-like headquarters. The building was a marvel of defensive architecture, reinforced concrete construction, automated weapon systems, and what appeared to be some kind of large dish antenna on the roof. "Analysis indicates significant defensive upgrades in the past 48 hours, the AI reported. "Personnel count has tripled. Vehicle presence includes armored cars, and what appears to be military-grade equipment. Unknown device on roof structure suggests advanced defensive systems." Jonathan studied the imagery with professional interest. Morrison was clearly preparing for a final confrontation, bringing all his resources to bear in one last desperate gambit. The arms dealer had always been clever. It was how he'd built his empire and stayed ahead of his enemies for so long. But cleverness wouldn't save him from the storm that was coming. "Computer, initiate final suit preparation sequence," Jonathan ordered. "Full combat loadout, maximum power reserves. And prepare the aircraft for immediate deployment." Acknowledged. Estimated flight time to Las Vegas, 3 hours, 47 minutes. Recommend night deployment for optimal stealth characteristics. Jonathan nodded. A night attack would provide the best tactical advantage, allowing him to approach Morrison's compound without being detected by civilian air traffic control. The modified VTOL aircraft was virtually invisible to radar, but there was no point in taking unnecessary risks. As the laboratory's robotic systems prepared the tornado suit for its final mission, Jonathan walked to Mary's memorial wall one last time. Her photograph smiled back at him, the woman who had been his partner, his inspiration, his anchor to humanity. "This is it, sweetheart," Jonathan whispered. "After tonight, Morrison will pay for what he did to you. Justice will finally be served." But even as he said the words, Jonathan felt a hollow ache in his chest. Killing Morrison wouldn't bring Mary back. It wouldn't restore the life they'd built together, wouldn't give him back the future they'd planned. All it would do was balance the scales, a death for a death, blood for blood. Yet he had to finish it. Not just for Mary, but for everyone Morrison had hurt over the years. The arms dealer had built his fortune on stolen technology and innocent blood, and he'd continued to operate, because the system protected men like him while abandoning their victims. Jonathan had become something the system couldn't ignore, a force of nature that delivered justice when law and order failed. Computer, aircraft status report. All systems optimal. Ion propulsion, ready. Stealth characteristics, active. Cargo deployment system, armed and ready. Jonathan took one last look around his laboratory, the place where grief had been transformed into purpose, where love had been forged into vengeance. After tonight, he might never see it again. Win or lose, the man who returned from Las Vegas would be different from the one who left. "Initiate launch sequence," Jonathan commanded. "It's time to end this." The flight to Las Vegas took just under 4 hours, the stealth aircraft cutting through the night sky like a mechanical ghost. Jonathan spent the time reviewing his mission planning and conducting final systems checks on the Tornado suit. Everything had to be perfect. He would only get one chance at Morrison. As the aircraft approached Las Vegas airspace, Jonathan could see the city's lights sprawling across the desert like a galaxy of neon and glass. Somewhere in that maze of buildings, Frank Morrison was waiting, probably confident that his defenses would protect him from the storm that was coming. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Computer, display target facility in detail. The aircraft's sensors painted a comprehensive picture of Morrison's compound. The building was definitely designed as a fortress, with thick walls, minimal windows, and sophisticated security systems. But Jonathan could also see something else, some kind of large dish antenna on the roof that hadn't been there in earlier surveillance photos. "Unknown device shows signs of recent installation," the AI reported. "Configuration suggests directed energy weapon or communications array. Recommend caution during approach." Jonathan frowned. Morrison was clearly planning something, but conventional weapons, even directed energy systems, were useless against the forces Jonathan commanded. A tornado was a chaotic system that couldn't be disrupted by linear technology. "Initiate high-altitude deployment," Jonathan ordered. "I want to drop directly onto the target facility. Deployment altitude, 500 meters. Target coordinates locked. Opening cargo bay doors." The aircraft's bay doors opened silently, revealing the glittering lights of Las Vegas spread out below. Cold air rushed into the cabin as Jonathan made his final preparations, running through the deployment checklist one last time. This was it. The end of his journey from loving husband to agent of vengeance. Tornado Mark 1 systems online, the suit announced as Jonathan settled into its mechanical embrace. All systems optimal. Deployment altitude confirmed. Target, Frank Morrison compound. Mission parameters, total facility destruction. Jonathan felt the familiar sensation of the neural interface synchronizing with his brain patterns, the quantum sensors mapping the pathways that would allow him to control the suit's incredible power. The heads-up display came alive with tactical information, wind speed, atmospheric pressure, target coordinates, system status indicators. "Deploy," Jonathan commanded. The suit dropped from the aircraft like a falling star, plummeting through the darkness toward Morrison's fortress below. Jonathan felt the familiar rush of free fall, the sensation of flying without wings that never failed to exhilarate him. At 800 meters altitude, thick clouds obscured his view of the target, providing perfect cover for his approach. Morrison's sensors might detect the approaching aircraft, but they would never see the human projectile falling through the overcast. At 300 meters, Jonathan burst through the cloud layer, and Morrison's compound appeared below him like a detailed architectural model. He could see guards patrolling the perimeter, vehicles positioned at defensive points, and spotlights sweeping the sky in search of aerial threats. But they were looking for aircraft, not a man in a mechanical suit falling out of the night sky. Parachute deployment in 3, 2, 1. Mark. The emergency parachute deployed with violent precision, slowing Jonathan's descent and giving him control over his landing point. He guided himself toward the center of Morrison's compound, where the building's courtyard would provide optimal positioning for the tornado deployment. At 50 meters altitude, Jonathan jettisoned the parachute and activated the suit's rotational systems. The massive blades extended from their housing with mechanical grace, and within seconds he was surrounded by the controlled chaos of an artificial tornado. The effect was even more dramatic in an urban environment. The spinning blades caught and scattered the compound's lights, creating a whirling column of illumination that could be seen for miles. Alarms began wailing immediately as Morrison's security forces scrambled to respond to the impossible sight bearing down on them. Jonathan touched down in the compound's central courtyard with the sound of thunder, the suit's feet cracking the concrete, as 2 tons of advanced machinery made contact with the ground. Around him, the tornado was already forming, pulling dust and debris into its vortex as the wind speed climbed toward hurricane force. "This is for Mary." Jonathan's voice boomed from the suit's external speakers, amplified to carry over the howling wind. The words echoed off the compound's walls like a battle cry, announcing the arrival of justice incarnate. Morrison's mercenaries opened fire immediately, streams of bullets from assault rifles and machine guns converging on Jonathan's position. But the rounds were swept away by the tornado's winds, or bounced harmlessly off the suit's hardened armor plating. Jonathan stood unmoved at the center of the storm, as implacable as a force of nature. F1 tornado achieved, the suit reported. Increasing to F2 intensity for optimal facility penetration. The tornado grew stronger, wider, more destructive. Vehicles were lifted from the ground and hurled through the air, their armored hulls crumpling like paper when they struck the compound's walls. Guard towers collapsed under the sustained assault of 150 mph winds, their occupants screaming as they were flung into the darkness. But even as Jonathan's tornado tore through Morrison's defenses, he could see the arms dealer's face at a reinforced window on the building's 3rd floor. Morrison was watching the destruction with a mixture of horror and fascination, as if he couldn't quite believe what his eyes were showing him. "Increase to F3 intensity," Jonathan commanded. "I want maximum destructive power." "Warning," the suit replied. "F3 tornado in urban environment will cause massive collateral damage. Recommend override safety protocols," Jonathan interrupted. "Maximum power, now." The tornado exploded outward, growing from a controlled vortex into a genuine force of nature. At 200 mph, the winds were strong enough to tear apart reinforced concrete, and Jonathan could see sections of Morrison's fortress beginning to collapse under the sustained assault. Then something unexpected happened. A brilliant flash of light erupted from the dish antenna on the building's roof, followed by a pulse of electromagnetic energy that struck the tornado like a physical blow. Jonathan felt the impact through the suit systems, the disruption that caused the vortex to wobble and lose coherence. "Warning," the suit announced urgently. "Detecting directed electromagnetic interference. Rotational systems experiencing destabilization. Tornado integrity compromised." Jonathan looked up to see the massive dish antenna tracking his position, energy crackling between its focusing elements, as it prepared for another pulse. Morrison had built some kind of weather control countermeasure, a weapon specifically designed to disrupt atmospheric manipulation systems. The arms dealer was more dangerous than Jonathan had given him credit for. Compensate for electromagnetic interference, Jonathan ordered. Increase power to rotational systems. Attempting compensation. Unable to maintain tornado stability under current interference pattern. Recommend immediate extraction. Another pulse struck the tornado, and this time Jonathan felt the suit's system strain under the electromagnetic assault. The vortex began to collapse, its carefully maintained structure breaking apart under the directed energy attack. But Jonathan wasn't finished yet. If the tornado couldn't penetrate Morrison's defenses, he would find another way. Shut down rotational systems, he commanded. Switch to direct assault mode. Acknowledged. Warning: direct assault mode removes atmospheric protection. Operator will be exposed to enemy fire. Do it. The tornado dissipated as the suit's blades retracted, leaving Jonathan standing alone in the compound's courtyard. Morrison's surviving mercenaries immediately opened fire, their bullets striking the suit's armor with metallic pings and sparks. But the Tornado Mark I had been designed to withstand far worse than small arms fire. Jonathan began walking toward the main building, each step covering several meters, as the suit's enhanced stride carried him forward with unstoppable momentum. Target the roof antenna, Jonathan ordered. I want that weapon destroyed. The suit's targeting system locked onto the electromagnetic pulse generator, and Jonathan raised his arm toward the device. Built into the suit's forearm was a directed energy weapon of his own, a laser system powerful enough to cut through armored steel. The laser fired with a brilliant flash, its focused beam slicing through the antenna's support structure like a hot knife through butter. The massive dish collapsed onto the roof with a thunderous crash, its electromagnetic pulse generator sparking and smoking as it died. Morrison's trump card was gone. Reactivate rotational systems, Jonathan commanded. F3 Tornado, full power. The tornado reformed around Jonathan with renewed fury, fed by his rage and grief and the certainty that justice was finally within reach. The winds reached peak intensity almost immediately, and Morrison's fortress began to come apart like a house of cards. Windows exploded inward under the pressure differential. Walls cracked and crumbled as debris traveling at 200 miles per hour struck them repeatedly. The building's facade was stripped away layer by layer, exposing the internal structure like a dissected machine. Through his sensors, Jonathan could see Morrison in what appeared to be a reinforced safe room, surrounded by his remaining security personnel. The arms dealer's face was pale with terror, as he watched his empire literally being torn apart around him. Time to end this, Jonathan said softly. He directed the tornado toward Morrison's position, the spinning blades cutting through the building's walls like a massive buzzsaw. Concrete and steel were pulverized and swept away, leaving nothing but destruction in the vortex's wake. Morrison tried to run, bursting from his safe room and sprinting toward what looked like an armored vehicle in the building's underground garage. But the tornado was faster, its irresistible winds catching the fleeing man and lifting him into the air. For a moment, Morrison hung suspended in the vortex, his arms and legs flailing helplessly as he was caught in the eye of the storm. Jonathan could see the terror in his eyes, the same terror that Mary must have felt in her final moments. This is justice, Jonathan said, his voice carrying over the howling wind. This is what you earned when you murdered my wife. The tornado's cutting blades claimed Frank Morrison with surgical precision, ending the arms dealer's life in an instant. There was no drama, no final words, no last-minute reprieve. Just the mathematical certainty of cause and effect, action and consequence. Justice had been served. Jonathan stood in the ruins of Morrison's compound for several long minutes, letting the tornado dissipate as he surveyed the destruction he had wrought. The fortress was gone, reduced to scattered debris across several city blocks. Of Morrison's security force, there were perhaps a handful of survivors fleeing into the Las Vegas night. Mission complete, Jonathan announced to the suit's computer. Target eliminated. All objectives achieved. Acknowledged. Recommend immediate extraction before emergency services arrive. Jonathan looked up to see his aircraft descending from the clouds, its stealth systems making it nearly invisible against the night sky. The autonomous vehicle would extract him from the target zone and return him to Denver, where he could disappear into the anonymity of his mansion laboratory. As he walked toward the extraction point, Jonathan felt empty. The rage that had driven him for months was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that had nothing to do with physical pain. Morrison was dead, his empire destroyed, but Mary was still gone. Nothing Jonathan had done would bring her back. Yet somehow, he felt as though she would approve. Mary had always believed in justice, in protecting the innocent from those who would exploit them. Morrison had been a cancer on the world, and Jonathan had excised him with surgical precision. Computer, initiate return flight to Denver, Jonathan commanded as he climbed aboard the aircraft. And prepare a comprehensive analysis of all defense contractors currently under federal investigation. I want to know who else might need correction. Acknowledged. Analysis will be complete upon arrival at base. As the aircraft lifted off from the ruins of Morrison's compound, Jonathan realized that his journey was far from over. Morrison had been one man, one criminal among many. There were others out there, arms dealers and corrupt officials and corporate criminals who preyed on the innocent because they thought the system would protect them. They were about to learn that some forms of justice transcended law and order. The winds of vengeance were becoming something larger, the winds of justice itself. Chapter 8. Internal Investigation. Detective Sarah Chen stared at the case file spread across her desk, trying to make sense of evidence that seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about the Jonathan Ratch investigation. It had been 6 months since the bizarre series of natural disasters that had struck defense contractor facilities across the western United States, and now new information was forcing her to reconsider everything. Mike, she called to her partner, Detective Torres, who was sitting at his own desk reviewing crime scene photographs. Come look at this. Torres walked over, coffee mug in hand, and peered at the documents Chen had assembled. What am I looking at? Bank records, Chen replied. Frank Morrison's bank records. Look at these payments, all made in the weeks following Mary Ratch's death, all to the same group of mercenaries. Torres leaned closer, his expression growing serious as he studied the financial data. Holy shit. These are payments to the guys who supposedly died in that Nevada tornado. But according to this, Morrison was paying them right up until. He checked the dates. Right up until 2 days before the Nevada facility was destroyed. Chen nodded grimly. It gets better. I've been cross-referencing Morrison's phone records with the timeline of the Ratch investigation. Look at this: 3 calls to Detective Bradley on the day after Mary Ratch was killed. Bradley was the lead investigator, who classified the case as a vehicular accident. Bradley's been on Morrison's payroll, Torres said, his voice tight with anger. Son of a bitch has been taking bribes. Not just Bradley. I found evidence of payments to at least 6 different officers in the department, plus prosecutors, judges, and federal agents. Morrison had half the law enforcement apparatus in his pocket. Torres sat down heavily in a nearby chair. Jesus, Sarah. If this is true, then Jonathan Ratch was right all along. His wife really was murdered, and we covered it up. Chen felt sick to her stomach. She'd been a cop for 15 years, and she'd always believed in the system, trusted that justice would eventually prevail. But the evidence before her painted a picture of corruption, so widespread that it challenged everything she thought she knew about law enforcement. "There's more," she said quietly. "I've been looking into Morrison's business operations. The man was running weapons to terrorist organizations, selling stolen military technology to foreign governments, and bribing defense officials to get classified contracts. He should have been in federal prison years ago. Instead, he was walking free while his victim's husband was treated like a traumatized fantasist," Torres said bitterly. No wonder Ratch took matters into his own hands. Chen looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Torres gestured toward the evidence files. "Come on, Sarah. You don't really believe those were natural disasters, do you? The Nevada facility, the Montana research station, Morrison's Las Vegas compound, all destroyed by freak tornadoes that appeared out of nowhere. In locations where tornadoes never occur. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Jonathan Ratch is a genius engineer who built some kind of weather control device and used it to eliminate the people who murdered his wife. And honestly, I don't blame him." Chen stared at her partner in shock. "Mike, you can't be serious. You're talking about vigilante justice, about taking the law into your own hands. Am I? Or am I talking about justice, period?" Torres stood up and began pacing. "Look at the evidence, Sarah. The system failed. Morrison murdered an innocent woman and walked free because he had enough money to buy protection. The cops, the prosecutors, the judges, they all took his money and looked the other way. That doesn't justify, doesn't it?" Torres interrupted. "How many other people died because Morrison was allowed to continue operating? How many weapons did he sell to criminals and terrorists while we were covering up his crimes?" Chen couldn't argue with that. The evidence showed that Morrison's illegal operations had continued for months after Mary Ratch's death, facilitated by the corrupt officials on his payroll. Weapons had flowed to criminal organizations, classified technology had been sold to hostile governments, and innocent people had died as a result. "What do you want to do?" she asked finally. Torres sat back down and looked directly at his partner. "I want to do our job. The real job, finding the truth and serving justice. We may not be able to prove that Jonathan Ratch built a weather control device, but we can sure as hell prove that Frank Morrison was a murderer, and half the department was helping him cover it up." Chen nodded slowly. "It'll be career suicide. Going after this many corrupt officials. They'll find a way to destroy us. Maybe. But I'd rather be destroyed doing the right thing than live with myself knowing I helped cover up murder." The internal investigation took 8 months to complete, and when it was finished, the scandal rocked law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Detective Bradley was arrested on charges of accepting bribes and obstruction of justice. 2 prosecutors were indicted for suppressing evidence. A federal judge was impeached for taking payments to dismiss cases against Morrison's organization. The media coverage was intense, but ultimately focused on the corruption rather than the mysterious circumstances surrounding Morrison's death. The official cause remained listed as death by natural disaster, specifically the tornado that had struck his Las Vegas compound. No one seriously investigated the possibility that the tornado had been artificially created. Jonathan watched the news coverage from his laboratory, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness as corrupt officials were led away in handcuffs. Justice was being served, but it felt hollow without Mary there to share it. "Computer, display news analysis summary," Jonathan commanded. Investigation has resulted in 23 arrests, 41 indictments, and comprehensive reforms to defense contracting oversight, the AI reported. Public confidence in law enforcement has been significantly impacted, but long-term reforms are expected to reduce corruption. Jonathan nodded. The system was cleaning itself, purging the corrupt elements that had allowed men like Morrison to operate with impunity. It would take years to fully restore public trust, but the process had begun. What's the status on other potential targets? Analysis of defense contractors under federal investigation has identified 14 individuals with patterns of behavior similar to Morrison. Recommend continued surveillance to determine if intervention is necessary. Jonathan studied the profiles that appeared on his holographic display. Arms dealers, corrupt officials, corporate criminals, all of them protected by money and connections, all of them confident that the system would shield them from consequences. They were wrong. Initiate deep surveillance protocols on all targets, Jonathan ordered. I want to know everything about their operations, their associates, their vulnerabilities. Acknowledged. Estimated completion time for comprehensive analysis, 6 weeks. Jonathan walked to Mary's memorial wall and stood before her photographs, feeling the familiar mixture of love and loss that always accompanied these moments. 6 months had passed since Morrison's death, but the grief remained as sharp as ever. I kept my promise, he whispered to her image. Morrison paid for what he did to you. Justice was served. But even as he said the words, Jonathan knew that his work was far from finished. Morrison had been one man, one criminal among many. The system that had protected him, the network of corruption and greed that allowed evil to flourish, that was still out there. Jonathan had become something more than a grieving husband seeking revenge. He had become an instrument of justice, a force of nature that could reach places the law couldn't touch. And there were others who needed that kind of justice. Computer, begin preliminary design work on Tornado Mark II, Jonathan commanded. I want improvements to power efficiency, operational range, and stealth capabilities. Acknowledged. Initiating design protocols for next-generation atmospheric manipulation system. Jonathan turned away from Mary's memorial and walked to his primary workstation, where blueprints for advanced technology covered every surface. The laboratory hummed with activity as automated systems began fabricating components for projects that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He had tried to be a good man, to work within the system, to trust that justice would prevail through proper channels. But the system had failed him, failed Mary, and failed countless others who needed protection from predators like Morrison. So Jonathan had become something else, something that could deliver justice when law and order fell short. The tornado suit was more than just a weapon, it was a symbol, a promise that evil actions would have consequences even when conventional justice failed. Mary would never come back. The life they had planned together was gone forever. But her death had created something that could protect others from suffering the same fate. This is who I am now, Jonathan said quietly to the empty laboratory. This is who I have to be. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Rocky Mountains, dark and threatening against the evening sky. But Jonathan barely noticed the natural weather. His attention was focused on the artificial storms he could create, controlled tempests that could reach anywhere, strike anyone, and deliver justice with the fury of nature itself. Somewhere in the world, another Frank Morrison was planning to hurt innocent people, confident that money and corruption would protect him from consequences. That confidence was about to be shattered by winds that could not be bought, bargained with, or escaped. Jonathan Ratch had died on a mountain road with his wife. What remained was something else entirely, a force of nature with a human heart and an engineer's precision. The winds of justice were gathering strength, and they would blow wherever they were needed. In his private study, Jonathan opened a new file on his computer and began typing. There will always be predators in this world, people who use wealth and power to harm the innocent while hiding behind corruption and influence. The system we trust to protect us sometimes fails, compromised by greed and cowardice. When that happens, when law and order abandon their sacred duty, other forms of justice must arise. I have become that justice. I am the storm that comes for those who think they are untouchable, the wind that sweeps away corruption, the force of nature that reminds evil men that their actions have consequences. This is my purpose now. This is my gift to a world that too often abandons the innocent to predators. I am the winds of justice, and I will blow wherever I am needed. For Mary. For all the Marys of the world who deserve better than a system that fails them. The storm is coming. And there is nowhere to hide. Jonathan saved the file and closed the computer. Tomorrow, he would begin hunting the next target on his list. Tonight, he would remember his wife and prepare for the battles to come. The transformation was complete. Jonathan Ratch, the man, was gone. What remained was something larger, something necessary, something the world needed even if it didn't understand it yet. The winds of justice had found their voice, and they would never be silent again. Epilogue 1 year later, Detective Sarah Chen stood in the rain outside the federal courthouse in Denver, watching as the last of Morrison's corrupt associates was led away in handcuffs. The investigation had consumed her life for months, but it had been worth it. 23 criminals were now behind bars. The defense contracting industry was under comprehensive reform, and public trust in law enforcement was slowly being restored. But she knew the real story would never be told. Chen pulled her coat tighter against the cold and walked to her car, her mind drifting to the mystery that had started it all. Jonathan Ratch lived quietly in his mountain mansion now, rarely seen in public, officially listed as a reclusive inventor working on classified government projects. The strange weather events had stopped after Morrison's death. No more freak tornadoes destroying criminal enterprises. No more impossible storms appearing out of nowhere. Whatever Jonathan Ratch had built, whatever justice he had delivered, it seemed to have served its purpose. Or perhaps it was simply waiting for the next Frank Morrison to emerge from the shadows. Chen started her car and drove into the Denver night, past the lights of the city and up into the mountains where the wealthy and powerful built their fortresses. Somewhere up there, in a laboratory that officially didn't exist, a brilliant engineer was probably working on technologies that could reshape the world. She hoped he would use them wisely. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and carrying the promise of storms yet to come. And in his mountain laboratory, Jonathan Ratch worked by the light of holographic displays, preparing for battles that might never come, but must always be ready to fight. The winds of justice were patient. They could wait. But they would never stop blowing. Chapter 9. A new threat emerges. 18 months after Frank Morrison's death, Jonathan Ratch had settled into a routine that balanced his public persona as a reclusive inventor with his secret mission as an agent of justice. The basement laboratory of his Denver mansion had been expanded significantly, now housing not just the original Tornado Mark I suit, but also its successor, the Mark II, with improved power systems, enhanced stealth capabilities, and more sophisticated atmospheric manipulation technology. But on this particular gray February morning, Jonathan's attention was focused not on engineering marvels, but on a news report that made his blood run cold. The death toll from the contaminated batch of novacillin has now risen to 847 people, with over 3,000 more hospitalized in critical condition, the CNN anchor was saying. The FDA has announced a criminal investigation into Helix Pharmaceuticals, but CEO Victoria Stenbridge maintains that the contamination was an isolated manufacturing error, and that her company is fully cooperating with authorities. Jonathan muted the television and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Novacillin was a life-saving antibiotic used to treat severe infections in cancer patients and others with compromised immune systems. The contaminated batch had contained a deadly fungal toxin that had turned the medicine into poison, killing hundreds of the most vulnerable patients in hospitals across the country. Computer, "Pull up everything we have on Helix Pharmaceuticals and Victoria Stenbridge," Jonathan commanded. "Accessing public records and intelligence databases," the AI responded. Helix Pharmaceuticals is a Fortune 500 company with annual revenues of $47 billion. CEO Victoria Stenbridge has been with the company for 12 years, rising from regional sales manager to chief executive. Current net worth, estimated to $3 billion. Jonathan studied the information as it appeared on his holographic display. Stenbridge was a striking woman in her early 50s, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of ruthless smile that came from years of corporate warfare. Her biography read like a case study in ambitious opportunism, cutting costs, eliminating competitors, and maximizing profits at every turn. What about the contamination incident? Any indication this wasn't an isolated error? Analyzing. Cross-referencing internal communications obtained through whistleblower sources. Analysis indicates 73% probability that contamination was result of cost-cutting measures implemented by Stenbridge administration. Manufacturing safety protocols were reduced by 60% over past 2 years to increase profit margins. Jonathan felt the familiar stirring of anger that had driven him to hunt Morrison. Another corporate predator, another person who thought wealth and power put them above consequences, another criminal who would likely escape real justice through legal technicalities and bought influence. Continue analysis. I want to know everything about Stenbridge's operation, her facilities, her security, her vulnerabilities. Acknowledged. Preliminary analysis indicates Helix maintains 17 manufacturing facilities globally, with primary executive offices in Manhattan and Chicago. Stenbridge divides her time between both locations, traveling in heavily secured corporate aircraft. Jonathan stood and walked to the window overlooking the snow-covered Rocky Mountains. The view reminded him of the day he'd first conceived the Tornado Project, a theoretical exercise that had become the instrument of his transformation from engineer to guardian. But this situation was different from Morrison's crimes. Morrison had been a clear-cut villain, an arms dealer who murdered innocent people and sold weapons to terrorists. Stenbridge operated in the gray areas of corporate malfeasance, where greed and negligence created body counts, just as surely as bullets, but where traditional law enforcement struggled to assign blame. The legal system would spend years investigating Helix Pharmaceuticals. Teams of lawyers would argue about regulatory compliance and manufacturing standards. Stenbridge would pay fines that represented a fraction of her company's profits, accept a settlement that admitted no wrongdoing, and continue operating as before. Meanwhile, hundreds of families would bury loved ones who had died from medicine that was supposed to save them. Computer, have there been other incidents involving Helix products? Affirmative. Analysis of FDA records and medical journals indicates pattern of safety violations and adverse events. 17 separate incidents over past 4 years, resulting in combined death toll of 247 individuals. In each case, Helix paid financial settlements while denying wrongdoing. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists. Over 1,200 people dead, because one woman prioritized profit margins over human lives. And the system had let her continue operating, collecting her settlements like a cost of doing business while bodies piled up in her wake. What about criminal charges? Has Stenbridge ever faced prosecution? Negative. All incidents resolved through civil settlements or regulatory fines. Stenbridge has never been personally charged with criminal conduct. Just like Morrison, Stenbridge had learned to navigate the system's weaknesses. She understood that corporate structure could shield individuals from consequences, that regulatory agencies were understaffed and underfunded, that civil settlements were cheaper than fundamental safety improvements. She was about to learn that some forms of justice couldn't be bought or litigated away. Computer, Initiate deep surveillance protocols on Victoria Stenbridge and Helix Pharmaceuticals. I want real-time tracking of her movements, communications intercepts, and detailed analysis of all company facilities. Acknowledged. Surveillance protocols activated. Estimated time to complete comprehensive analysis, 72 hours. Jonathan returned to his workstation and began reviewing the technical specifications for the Tornado Mark II. The new suit incorporated lessons learned from his campaign against Morrison, with improved power efficiency, enhanced stealth capabilities, and more sophisticated targeting systems. But this mission would require different tactics. Morrison had operated from remote facilities in the desert, making him vulnerable to direct assault. Stenbridge lived and worked in densely populated urban areas, surrounded by innocent civilians who could be caught in the crossfire. Jonathan would need to be more surgical in his approach, more precise in his application of justice. The tornado was a weapon of awesome power, but it was also indiscriminate in its destruction. For this mission, he would need to develop new capabilities. Computer, begin design analysis for focused atmospheric manipulation system. I want the ability to create localized pressure differentials without generating full tornado formation. Initiating design protocols. Recommend integration with existing Mark II platform for maximum efficiency. As the computer began processing his requirements, Jonathan walked to Mary's memorial wall and stood before her photographs. Her smile seemed to encourage him, to remind him why he had chosen this path. There's another predator out there, sweetheart, he whispered to her image. Another person who thinks money puts them above consequences. But she's about to learn that some debts can't be paid with legal settlements. Jonathan had spent the past 18 months refining his methods, becoming more systematic in his approach to justice. He'd identified other potential targets, corrupt officials, corporate criminals, and exploitative predators who thrived in the system's gray areas. But he'd been waiting for the right moment, the right target, the right circumstances. Victoria Stenbridge had just provided all three. 3 days later, Jonathan had assembled a comprehensive intelligence package on his new target. Victoria Stenbridge was a creature of habit, dividing her time between Helix's Manhattan headquarters and her penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side. She traveled in armored vehicles with professional security teams, dined at exclusive restaurants, and attended charity galas, where she donated money with one hand while collecting blood money with the other. But habits created vulnerabilities, and Jonathan had identified several opportunities for intervention. Computer, display Stenbridge's schedule for the next week. The holographic display showed a detailed timeline of the pharmaceutical executives' planned activities. Board meetings, investor conferences, media interviews, all while hundreds of families buried loved ones killed by her contaminated medicine. Tomorrow evening, she's scheduled to attend a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Jonathan noted. Ironic that she's fundraising for childhood cancer research, while her products kill cancer patients. Analysis indicates high-profile event with extensive security presence. Manhattan location complicates deployment of tornado-based systems due to civilian population density. Jonathan nodded. He'd already considered and rejected a direct assault on the museum. Too many innocent people, too much collateral damage potential, and too much risk of civilian casualties. He needed a different approach. What about her penthouse apartment? Security arrangements. Stenbridge maintains primary residence in converted penthouse occupying top 3 floors of luxury building. Private elevator access, dedicated security team, and reinforced construction. Building houses 47 other residential units, with estimated 130 civilian occupants. Again, too many innocents at risk. Jonathan's mission was to eliminate predators, not create collateral damage that would make him no better than the criminals he hunted. Computer, Analyze Stenbridge's corporate facilities. I want options for targeting her company's infrastructure without risking civilian casualties. Processing. Helix Pharmaceuticals operates primary manufacturing facility in upstate New York. Facility produces 67% of company's North American drug supply, including Novacillin production line. Night shift, minimal staffing, isolated location reduces civilian risk. Jonathan studied the satellite imagery of the facility. It was perfect, a massive pharmaceutical manufacturing complex located in a rural area, far from population centers. Destroying it would cripple Stenbridge's ability. Begin mission planning protocols for Adirondack facility, Jonathan commanded. I want complete tactical analysis, weather patterns, and extraction options. Acknowledged. Estimated completion time, 6 hours. As the computer began processing his requirements, Jonathan walked to the armor cradle where the Tornado Mark II waited. The new suit was sleeker than its predecessor, with improved aerodynamics and enhanced stealth capabilities. But more importantly, it incorporated the new focused atmospheric manipulation system he'd been developing. Instead of generating full tornado formation, the Mark II could create localized pressure differentials, focused wind bursts, and precision atmospheric effects. Jonathan could collapse a building with surgical precision while leaving adjacent structures untouched. He could generate crushing pressure waves that would affect only his target, or create devastating wind shears that would strike with the accuracy of a sniper's bullet. Victoria Stenbridge had built her fortune on the calculated murder of innocent people, confident that corporate structure and legal technicalities would shield her from consequences. She was about to learn that some forms of justice transcended courtrooms and corporate boardrooms. The weekend couldn't come soon enough. Victoria Stenbridge stood on the deck of her Adirondack retreat, sipping imported wine and reviewing quarterly profit reports, while her legal team briefed her on strategies for minimizing liability from the Novacillin contamination. The mountain air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the polluted moral atmosphere of her corporate empire. The key is to maintain our position that this was an isolated manufacturing error, her chief counsel was saying. We've already identified the batch supervisor as a scapegoat. He's been with the company for 30 years. So his termination will look like decisive action. Stenbridge nodded approvingly. What about the FDA investigation? Senator Morrison has assured us that the committee will focus on regulatory framework rather than individual accountability. The worst-case scenario is new manufacturing requirements that we can implement over 5 years with federal subsidies. And the families filing wrongful death suits. We'll settle out of court with standard non-disclosure agreements. Budget $500 million for settlements, still less than the cost of implementing comprehensive safety upgrades. Stenbridge smiled coldly. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering over the Adirondack peaks, dark and threatening against the evening sky. But these weren't natural weather patterns, they were the approaching winds of justice, guided by an intelligence that had studied Stenbridge's crimes with the same methodical precision she'd used to calculate acceptable casualty rates. The storm was coming for Victoria Stenbridge, and there was nowhere to hide. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. Jonathan's stealth aircraft descended through the cloud cover over the Adirondack Mountains like a mechanical ghost, its ion propulsion systems making no sound as it approached Victoria Stenbridge's private retreat. The facility sprawled across a secluded valley, a complex of luxury buildings designed to look like a rustic lodge, but equipped with every modern amenity money could buy. Through the aircraft's advanced sensors, Jonathan could see the heat signatures of Stenbridge's security team, 12 professionals positioned around the perimeter, all armed with military-grade weapons. The pharmaceutical executive was taking no chances, even in her mountain sanctuary. But conventional security was useless against the forces Jonathan commanded. Computer, display final tactical analysis, Jonathan commanded from the pilot's seat. Target facility analysis complete. the AI responded. Primary target confirmed in main lodge structure. Security personnel, 12 individuals with standard armament. Civilian staff, minimal, isolated in service buildings. Weather conditions, optimal for atmospheric manipulation deployment. Jonathan studied the three-dimensional holographic display showing every detail of Stenbridge's retreat. The main lodge was built like a fortress, with reinforced walls, bulletproof windows, and a sophisticated security system. But it wasn't designed to withstand the focused fury of an artificial storm. Initiate final suit preparation sequence, Jonathan ordered. Combat configuration, focused atmospheric manipulation protocol. The Tornado Mark II powered up in the aircraft's deployment bay, its systems running through automated pre-flight checks, while Jonathan reviewed his mission parameters one final time. This would be different from his previous missions, more precise, more surgical, more focused on eliminating the specific threat, while minimizing collateral damage. Stenbridge had earned her fate through the calculated murder of innocent people, but her security team and staff were just doing their jobs. Jonathan would need to be precise in his application of justice. Suit systems online, the Mark II announced as Jonathan settled into its mechanical embrace. All systems optimal. Focused atmospheric manipulation, ready for deployment. Neural interface, synchronized. Mission parameters, eliminate primary target, minimize collateral damage. Jonathan felt the familiar sensation of the neural interface connecting with his brain patterns, the quantum sensors mapping the pathways that would allow him to control the suit's incredible power. But this time, Jonathan descended through the night sky like a controlled meteor, surrounded by a localized atmospheric disturbance that was invisible to conventional detection systems. To anyone watching from the ground, he would appear to be a trick of the light, a momentary shadow against the stars. He touched down in the forest 50 meters from the main lodge, the suit's impact absorption systems allowing for a silent landing despite the tremendous kinetic energy involved. Around him, the trees swayed in response to the atmospheric disturbance, but there was no dramatic tornado formation to announce his arrival. Jonathan was learning to be subtle. Target facility confirmed, the suit reported. Primary target located in main lodge, second floor. Security perimeter established, but unaware of insertion. Recommend immediate approach before detection. Jonathan began moving through the forest toward Stenbridge's retreat, the suit's enhanced mobility allowing him to cover ground with surprising speed despite the dense undergrowth. Night vision systems painted the world in shades of green and silver, highlighting every detail of the terrain ahead. The first security guard never knew what hit him. Jonathan emerged from the tree line like a mechanical ghost, the suit's stealth systems rendering him nearly invisible in the darkness. A focused burst of compressed air struck the guard with the force of a sledgehammer, knocking him unconscious without causing permanent injury. Perimeter breach undetected, the suit reported. 11 remaining security personnel, none aware of intrusion. Jonathan moved closer to the main lodge, neutralizing guards with surgical precision. The Mark II's focused atmospheric manipulation system allowed him to create pressure waves that could render targets unconscious, without killing them, a level of control that the original Tornado system had never provided. Within minutes, he had cleared a path to the lodge's main entrance. Through the building's windows, he could see Stenbridge and her legal team still meeting in the main conference room, completely oblivious to the danger that had penetrated their supposedly secure retreat. Computer, isolate target's location and create precision atmospheric event, Jonathan commanded. I want to collapse the conference room while leaving the rest of the building intact. Analyzing structural weakness points. Precision strike vector calculated. Warning: atmospheric manipulation in confined space may cause significant pressure damage to target. That's the point, Jonathan replied grimly. Execute. The Mark II's atmospheric manipulation system engaged with deadly precision. Instead of creating a tornado, it generated a focused pressure wave that struck the conference room like an invisible sledgehammer. The reinforced windows exploded inward, the walls cracked under the sudden pressure differential, and the ceiling began to sag under forces that conventional engineering had never anticipated. Victoria Stenbridge looked up from her profit reports, just in time to see death approaching in the form of collapsing architecture. Her scream was cut short as the conference room came apart around her, tons of steel and concrete crushing everything inside with mathematical precision. Primary target eliminated, the suit reported. Collateral damage, minimal. Building structure, 85% intact. Mission objectives, achieved. Jonathan stood in the ruins of Stenbridge's conference room, surveying the destruction he had wrought. The pharmaceutical executive was dead, crushed by the weight of her own greed and the carefully calculated pressure wave that had brought her mountain retreat down around her. Justice had been served with surgical precision. But as Jonathan prepared to leave the scene, his suit's sensors detected something unexpected: movement in the building's basement level. Someone had survived the attack, someone who was now trying to escape through what appeared to be a hidden passage. Computer, analyze basement heat signature. Single individual, adult male, moving through concealed tunnel system. Identification, unknown. Recommend investigation. Jonathan made his way to the basement, where he found a sophisticated tunnel network that obviously predated his attack. The passage was lined with reinforced concrete and equipped with emergency lighting, or escape route, that Stenbridge had prepared for exactly this kind of situation. The fleeing figure was one of Stenbridge's legal advisors, a man carrying a briefcase filled with what appeared to be classified documents. Jonathan caught up with him at the tunnel's exit, where the lawyer was attempting to reach a hidden vehicle. "Please," the man gasped when he saw Jonathan's imposing figure blocking his path. "I was just doing my job. I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Jonathan studied the man through his suit's sensors. The lawyer was terrified, clearly not a combatant, just another cog in Stenbridge's machine of exploitation. But the briefcase he carried might contain evidence of other crimes, other victims who deserved justice. "What's in the briefcase?" Jonathan asked, his voice amplified by the suit's external speakers. "Legal documents," the lawyer replied, his voice shaking. "Attorney-client privilege." "I can't." "Attorney-client privilege ended when your client died," Jonathan interrupted. "What's in the briefcase?" The lawyer opened the case with trembling hands, revealing hundreds of pages of documents detailing Stenbridge's operations. Contract specifications, regulatory correspondence, internal memos discussing acceptable casualty rates for contaminated medicine. And something else, evidence of other pharmaceutical companies engaged in similar practices, a network of corporate criminals who had turned medicine into a weapon of profit maximization. "Computer, scan and analyze all documents," Jonathan commanded. "I want complete intelligence breakdown on associated criminal organizations." Scanning. Analysis indicates extensive criminal network involving 7 pharmaceutical companies, multiple regulatory officials, and coordinated efforts to minimize safety standards for profit optimization. Estimated additional casualties, 4,000 individuals over past 5 years. Jonathan felt the familiar stirring of righteous anger. Stenbridge hadn't been operating alone, she'd been part of a larger conspiracy that had turned healthcare into a profit-driven killing machine. Other companies, other executives, other predators who needed to face justice. "You're going to walk away from here," Jonathan told the lawyer. "You're going to disappear, start a new life, and never work in pharmaceuticals again. But first, you're going to send copies of these documents to every major news organization in the country. But the non-disclosure agreements are void now that your client is dead," Jonathan reminded him. You have a choice: help expose this conspiracy, or become part of the problem that needs to be solved. The lawyer nodded frantically, clearly understanding the implied threat. He would cooperate, or he would face the same fate as his former employer. Go, Jonathan commanded. And remember, I'll be watching. The lawyer fled into the night, carrying evidence that would expose the pharmaceutical conspiracy and bring down the network of corporate criminals who had turned medicine into murder. Within hours, the documents would be in the hands of investigative journalists, federal prosecutors, and regulatory agencies. The system would finally have the evidence it needed to deliver justice through conventional channels. But Jonathan knew that wouldn't be enough. There were still predators out there, still criminals who thought wealth and power put them above consequences. The pharmaceutical conspiracy was just one tentacle of a larger monster that fed on human suffering. As he walked back to his extraction point, Jonathan felt the weight of his expanding mission. He'd started this journey seeking revenge for Mary's death, but it had evolved into something larger, a systematic campaign against predators who exploited the system's weaknesses to harm innocent people. Computer, analyze intelligence data, and identify primary targets in pharmaceutical conspiracy, Jonathan commanded as his stealth aircraft descended from the clouds. Analysis indicates 7 primary targets across 4 states. Recommend systematic elimination campaign over 6-month period. Jonathan climbed aboard the aircraft and began the journey back to Denver, his mind already planning the next phase of his mission. Victoria Stenbridge was dead, her conspiracy exposed, but there were others who needed to face justice. The winds of justice were gathering strength, and they would blow wherever they were needed. Corporate boardrooms, government offices, regulatory agencies, no sanctuary would protect predators from the storm that was coming. In his mountain laboratory, Jonathan would plan the next campaign, develop new technologies, and prepare for battles that would reshape the balance of power between predators and their victims. The transformation was accelerating. Jonathan Ratch was becoming something the world had never seen before, a force of nature with a moral compass, an instrument of justice that transcended law and order. And there were so many monsters still out there, waiting to be hunted. The storm was just getting started. To be continued. As Jonathan's aircraft disappeared into the night sky, leaving behind the ruins of Victoria Stenbridge's mountain retreat, news of the pharmaceutical conspiracy began to break across the nation. Within hours, federal agents were raiding corporate offices, arresting executives, and seizing evidence of crimes that had claimed thousands of lives. But in the shadows, other predators watched the news coverage with growing unease. Arms dealers, corrupt politicians, corporate criminals, and exploitative magnates, who had thought themselves untouchable, began to realize that the rules of the game had changed. Somewhere in the darkness, a storm was hunting them. And there was nowhere to hide from the winds of justice. The legend of the Tornado Man was just beginning. The Winds of Justice Chapters 11 to 12, Final Conclusion, Chapter 11. The network unveiled. The pharmaceutical conspiracy unraveled with stunning speed once the evidence from Victoria Stenbridge's briefcase hit the airwaves. Within 48 hours of her death, federal agents were conducting simultaneous raids across 7 states, arresting executives, seizing documents, and freezing corporate assets worth billions of dollars. Jonathan watched the news coverage from his laboratory, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and unease as the conspiracy he'd exposed consumed the headlines. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, every major network was covering what journalists were calling the largest corporate crime scandal in American history. The scope of the conspiracy is staggering, Anderson Cooper was saying on the main monitor. Internal documents show that 7 pharmaceutical companies coordinated efforts to reduce manufacturing safety standards, with executives calculating acceptable casualty rates as a cost of doing business. The death toll from contaminated medicines now exceeds 4,000 people over the past 5 years. Jonathan muted the audio and turned to his computer terminal, where intelligence analysis was streaming in real time. The evidence from Stenridge's files had revealed more than just a pharmaceutical conspiracy. It had exposed a vast network of corporate criminals who operated across multiple industries. Computer, display network analysis of all criminal associations identified in recovered documents. The holographic display filled with a complex web of interconnected nodes, showing relationships between pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, financial institutions, and regulatory agencies. At the center of the web was a name that made Jonathan's blood run cold: Marcus Kellerman. Analysis complete, the AI reported. Marcus Kellerman appears to be central coordinator for multi-industry criminal network. Age 67, net worth estimated at $15.8 billion, current residence, private island in international waters. Kellerman has been facilitating criminal enterprises for over 2 decades, providing coordination, financing, and legal protection for predatory corporations. Jonathan studied Kellerman's profile with growing amazement and disgust. The man was like a criminal mastermind from a thriller novel, a billionaire puppet master, who orchestrated suffering on a global scale, while remaining invisible to law enforcement. Morrison had been a brutal thug, Stenbridge a greedy executive, but Kellerman was something else entirely, evil incarnate. Computer, what's Kellerman's involvement with Morrison and Stenbridge? Cross-referencing financial records. Morrison received $47 million in funding from Kellerman-controlled shell companies over past 3 years. Stenbridge's cost-cutting initiatives were coordinated through Kellerman's consulting network. Analysis indicates Kellerman has been orchestrating criminal activities across defense contracting, pharmaceuticals, financial services, and regulatory capture. Jonathan felt the familiar surge of righteous anger, but this time it was tempered by something else. A cold, calculating fury that went beyond personal grief. Kellerman wasn't just another criminal, he was the source, the central node that enabled predators like Morrison and Stenbridge to operate with impunity. What kind of security does he maintain? Kellerman operates from fortified compound on privately owned island, 200 nautical miles off the Bahamas coast. Security includes military-grade defensive systems, private army of approximately 150 personnel, and advanced detection systems. Island is technically in international waters, beyond jurisdiction of any national authority. Jonathan smiled grimly. A private island fortress in international waters, the perfect sanctuary for someone who thought wealth could put them beyond the reach of justice. Kellerman had probably felt completely safe, orchestrating his network of criminals from his oceanic stronghold. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Computer, begin comprehensive analysis of Kellerman's island facility. I want detailed intelligence on defensive capabilities, personnel rotations, supply chains, and atmospheric conditions. Acknowledged. Maritime intelligence analysis initiated. Warning: target location presents significant logistical challenges for tornado-based assault systems. Jonathan nodded. The ocean environment would complicate his usual tactics. Tornadoes over water became waterspouts, which were less stable and harder to control than land-based atmospheric manipulation. And the isolated location meant no possibility of ground-based approach or conventional extraction. This mission would require something new. Computer, initiate design protocols for overwater atmospheric manipulation system. I want the capability to maintain tornado stability in maritime environment. Initiating design analysis. Recommend integration of marine-specific modifications to existing Mark II platform. Estimated development time, 2 weeks. Jonathan walked to his workbench, where components for the Mark III suit were already taking shape. Each iteration of the technology had been more sophisticated than the last, and this new version would need to be his masterpiece capable of operating in any environment, under any conditions. But as he began sketching modifications for maritime operations, Jonathan's secure communication system chimed with an incoming priority message. The sender ID made him freeze, Detective Sarah Chen. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then activated the secure channel. Chen's face appeared on his monitor, looking haggard and worried. "Mr. Ratch," she began without preamble, "we need to talk. And I mean face-to-face, not through encrypted channels." "Detective Chen. I assume this is about recent events." "You could say that. The pharmaceutical investigation has uncovered some interesting connections. Marcus Kellerman's name keeps appearing in contexts that suggest he's been orchestrating criminal enterprises for decades, including the one that killed your wife." Jonathan's expression hardened. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Frank Morrison wasn't operating independently when he murdered Mary. Financial records show he received significant funding from Kellerman-controlled organizations in the months before the attack. It looks like your wife's death was part of a larger pattern of eliminating threats to Kellerman's network." The revelation hit Jonathan like a physical blow. Mary hadn't died because of Morrison's personal grudge. She'd been murdered as part of a coordinated campaign to protect a vast criminal conspiracy. Her death had been calculated, planned, orchestrated by someone who saw human lives as obstacles to be removed. "Detective," Jonathan said carefully, "what exactly are you suggesting?" Chen leaned closer to her camera. "I'm suggesting that the mysterious weather events that have been eliminating criminals over the past 2 years aren't natural disasters. I'm suggesting that someone with advanced technology has been serving justice where the system failed. And I'm suggesting that this someone might be interested to know that the real architect of his wife's murder is still alive." Jonathan studied Chen's face, trying to read her intentions. Was this a trap? An attempt to gather evidence for prosecution? Or was she offering him intelligence that could help complete his mission? "Hypothetically," Jonathan said, "if such a person existed, what would you expect them to do with this information?" "Hypothetically," Chen replied, "I would expect them to be very interested in Marcus Kellerman's private island fortress. And I would expect that the next few weeks might see some unusual weather patterns in the Caribbean." Jonathan almost smiled. Chen was clearly offering him intelligence, while maintaining plausible deniability. She understood that conventional law enforcement couldn't touch someone like Kellerman, but she also understood that other forms of justice might be more effective. "Detective, I appreciate the information. Hypothetically, Mr. Ratch," Chen said seriously, "be careful out there. Kellerman isn't like the others you've encountered. He's been playing this game for decades, and he's survived because he's ruthless, intelligent, and completely without conscience. If someone were to go after him, they'd better be prepared for the fight of their life." The connection terminated, leaving Jonathan alone with the knowledge that his mission had come full circle. Mary's death hadn't been the random act of a jealous competitor. It had been ordered by the criminal mastermind who orchestrated suffering on a global scale. Marcus Kellerman had made it personal. "Computer, accelerate development timeline for Mark III maritime modifications. I want the suit ready for deployment within 1 week." Acknowledged. Initiating emergency development protocols. All non-essential projects suspended. Jonathan returned to his workbench with renewed purpose. He'd thought his mission was about justice for anonymous victims of corporate crime, but it had always been about Mary. Every criminal he'd eliminated, every conspiracy he'd exposed, every predator he'd brought down, it had all been leading to this moment. The man who had ordered his wife's murder was about to face the storm he'd created. 1 week later, Jonathan stood on the deck of a stolen yacht 50 nautical miles from Kellerman's island fortress, making final preparations for what he knew would be the most dangerous mission of his career. The Mark III suit gleamed in the moonlight, its new maritime modifications giving it an almost aquatic appearance. "Computer, final systems check," Jonathan commanded. "All systems optimal," the suit replied. "Maritime atmospheric manipulation, ready. Enhanced power systems, 100% capacity. Neural interface, calibrated for extended combat operations. Oceanic deployment protocols, active." Through high-powered binoculars, Jonathan could see Kellerman's Island in the distance, a fortress of glass and steel rising from the Caribbean like a modern Alcatraz. Lights blazed from every building, and he could see patrol boats circling the perimeter like mechanical sharks. Kellerman knew he was coming. The criminal mastermind had undoubtedly been monitoring the news coverage of the pharmaceutical conspiracy, had seen the pattern of mysterious weather events that had eliminated his associates. He'd prepared his defenses accordingly. But no defense could withstand what Jonathan was about to unleash. "Computer, initiate final approach sequence. Maritime deployment protocol." Jonathan dove from the yacht's deck, the Mark III suit cutting through the water like a mechanical dolphin. The new propulsion systems were nearly silent, allowing him to approach Kellerman's Island undetected by the patrol boats circling above. At 500 meters from the island's shore, Jonathan surfaced and activated the suit's atmospheric manipulation systems. Creating a tornado over water was more complex than land-based operations, but the Mark III's enhanced capabilities made it possible. The waterspout that formed around Jonathan was magnificent and terrifying, a column of swirling water, and air that rose 200 meters into the night sky. But unlike natural waterspouts, this one was perfectly controlled, guided by an intelligence that understood both meteorology and vengeance. Alarms began wailing across Kellerman's Island as the waterspout approached the shore. Searchlights swiveled wildly, trying to track the impossible weather phenomenon that was bearing down on the fortress. Anti-aircraft weapons opened fire, but their shells were swept away by the hurricane-force winds. Jonathan made landfall like a force of nature, the waterspout transforming into a land-based tornado as it struck the island's beaches. Palm trees were uprooted and flung into the air, defensive positions were swept away, and Kellerman's mercenaries fled in panic before the unstoppable storm. "This is for Mary," Jonathan's voice boomed from the tornado's center, amplified to carry across the entire island. "This is for everyone you've killed in your pursuit of profit. Justice has come for you, Marcus Kellerman." The tornado carved a path of destruction across the island, systematically dismantling Kellerman's defenses. Guard towers collapsed, weapons emplacements were torn apart, and armored vehicles were flung into the ocean like toys. But as Jonathan approached the main fortress, he encountered something unexpected, another weather manipulation system. Kellerman had been monitoring Jonathan's activities, had reverse-engineered his technology, and had built his own atmospheric control device. A second tornado formed on the opposite side of the island, spinning in the opposite direction from Jonathan's vortex. The two storms clashed with devastating force, their competing wind patterns creating a chaotic maelstrom of conflicting pressures and impossible meteorology. "Warning," the Mark III announced. "Detecting hostile atmospheric manipulation system. Tornado stability compromised by interference pattern." Jonathan fought to maintain control as the competing tornadoes tore at each other, their conflicting forces threatening to collapse both storms. But Kellerman's system was a crude copy, lacking the sophisticated controls and precision engineering of Jonathan's creation. "Increase power to maximum," Jonathan commanded. "Override all safety protocols." The Mark III systems responded with mechanical fury, drawing power from every available source to maintain tornado stability. The competing storm began to weaken, unable to match the focused intensity of Jonathan's technologically superior vortex. Kellerman's tornado collapsed, its crude control systems overwhelmed by the precision and power of the Mark III. Jonathan's storm resumed its advance on the main fortress, now unopposed and unstoppable. The billionaire's sanctuary came apart like a house of cards. Reinforced walls were sheared away by diamond-edged cutting blades, bulletproof windows exploded under pressure differentials, and the entire structure began to collapse under the sustained assault of 200 miles-per-hour winds. Through his sensors, Jonathan could see Kellerman in what appeared to be a panic room deep within the fortress, a reinforced bunker designed to withstand conventional military assault. But it wasn't designed to withstand the focused fury of a controlled tornado. The panic room's walls held for almost a minute before the sustained pressure finally breached them. Jonathan watched through his targeting system as Marcus Kellerman, the criminal mastermind, who had orchestrated Mary's death, and thousands of others, was swept away by the storm he'd tried to create. Justice had been served with mathematical precision. Target eliminated, the Mark III reported. Mission objectives achieved. Recommend immediate extraction before regional authorities respond. Jonathan stood in the ruins of Kellerman's island fortress, surrounded by the devastation he'd wrought. The criminal network's central node was gone, its coordinator eliminated, its empire beginning to collapse as the evidence Jonathan had gathered was distributed to law enforcement agencies worldwide. But as he prepared to leave, Jonathan realized something had changed within him. The rage that had driven him for years was finally spent, replaced by a strange sense of completion. Mary's death had been avenged, not just symbolically, but literally. The man who had ordered her murder was dead. Computer, initiate extraction sequence, Jonathan commanded. Mission complete. As his extraction aircraft descended from the night sky, Jonathan took one last look at the island that had been Kellerman's throne. Now it was just scattered debris on a Caribbean beach, testament to the truth that no fortress could protect predators from the consequences of their actions. The storm was finally over. The circle was complete. Chapter 12. Legacy of the Storm. 5 years later, Detective Sarah Chen stood in the gleaming lobby of the new Ratch Foundation headquarters in downtown Denver, reading the inscription carved into the marble wall, in memory of Dr. Mary Catherine Ratch, whose love of justice lives on in the protection of the innocent. The building was a monument to transformation. What had once been Jonathan's private laboratory was now the headquarters of one of the world's most effective anti-corruption organizations. The Ratch Foundation had become legendary in law enforcement circles, providing advanced investigative technology, legal support for whistleblowers, and coordination between agencies pursuing corporate criminals. Detective Chen. A young woman in a professional suit approached. Mr. Ratch will see you now. Chen followed the assistant to an elevator that rose silently to the building's top floor. The doors opened to reveal an office that looked more like a command center, with multiple monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the world. Jonathan Ratch stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Rocky Mountains in the distance. He was grayer now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but there was a sense of peace about him that hadn't been there during their previous meetings. Detective, Jonathan said without turning around. Thank you for coming. I was surprised to get your invitation, Chen replied. I thought you'd retired from active operations. Jonathan smiled slightly. I have. The tornado suits are decommissioned, stored in a vault that will remain sealed unless the world faces threats that conventional law enforcement can't handle. But the work continues in other ways. He gestured to the monitors around the office. The Foundation coordinates with law enforcement agencies in 47 countries. We've helped prosecute over 2,000 corporate criminals, recovered $50 billion in stolen assets, and prevented countless cases of the kind of predatory behavior that cost us so much. Chen studied the displays showing ongoing investigations, prosecutions, and policy reforms implemented in response to the Foundation's work. The system is working again. It's working better, Jonathan corrected. The shockwaves from those weather events 5 years ago changed how criminals think about risk and consequences. Corporate executives know that conventional protections, lawyers, bribes, regulatory capture, might not be enough to save them. The fear of accountability has made them more careful. And you're satisfied with that? Watching from the sidelines while others do the work. Jonathan finally turned to face her, and Chen was struck by the change in his expression. The cold fury that had driven him for so many years was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like contentment. I'm not watching from the sidelines, he said. I'm building something that will outlast me. The foundation will continue this work long after I'm gone, using technology and resources to ensure that the system serves justice rather than protecting predators. Chen nodded slowly. What about the technology itself? The tornado suits. Sealed away, Jonathan replied firmly. The world doesn't need that kind of power in anyone's hands, including mine. The threat of their existence is enough. Criminals know that somewhere out there, technology exists that can reach them no matter how well they think they are protected. Jonathan walked to his desk and picked up a photograph, the same picture of Mary that had adorned his laboratory wall for so many years. But now it was surrounded by other photos, children whose lives had been saved by safer medicines, families who had received justice through the Foundation's work, communities protected from corporate exploitation. Mary always believed that love was the most powerful force in the universe, Jonathan said softly. I spent years thinking that was naive, that only force and fear could deliver justice. But she was right in the end. Love for her memory, love for the innocent people we're protecting, that's what really drives everything we do here. Chen felt tears welling up in her eyes. She'd watched Jonathan transform from a grieving widower into an agent of vengeance, and now she was witnessing his final transformation into something else entirely, a guardian whose power came not from technology or fear, but from the love that had survived his darkest moments. The weather events have stopped completely, Chen observed. No more mysterious storms, no more impossible tornadoes. They are not needed anymore, Jonathan replied. The system has been shocked back into functionality. Criminals are being prosecuted, regulations are being enforced, and predators are facing real consequences for their actions. The storm served its purpose. And if that changes? If the system fails again? Jonathan's expression hardened slightly, and for just a moment Chen caught a glimpse of the man who had once commanded the fury of artificial hurricanes. Then the storm will return, he said quietly. But I hope that day never comes. As Detective Chen left the Ratch Foundation building, she reflected on the remarkable transformation she'd witnessed. Jonathan Ratch had become a legend in law enforcement circles, not as the mysterious figure who had eliminated criminals with impossible weather, but as the philanthropist who had revolutionized the fight against corruption. The Foundation's work was visible everywhere. Pharmaceutical companies that now prioritized safety over profit, defense contractors that operated under unprecedented transparency, financial institutions that faced real consequences for predatory practices. The culture of corporate criminality, that had flourished for decades, was retreating before a new paradigm of accountability. But Chen knew that Jonathan's greatest victory wasn't the criminals he'd eliminated, or the systems he'd reformed. It was the peace he'd found in channeling his grief into protection, rather than destruction, in building something that honored Mary's memory rather than simply avenging her death. That evening, Jonathan stood alone in his private study, looking at a wall covered with photographs of people whose lives had been saved by the Foundation's work. Thousands of faces, each representing a life protected from predators who would have exploited them without consequence. In the center of the display was Mary's photograph, her smile as radiant as ever. Jonathan touched the glass gently, feeling the familiar ache of loss that had never fully healed. I hope you're proud of what we've built, he whispered to her image. It's not the life we planned, but I think it's the life you would have wanted me to live. A soft chime from his computer indicated an incoming priority message. Jonathan turned to see a report from the Foundation's early warning system, evidence of a new corporate conspiracy emerging in Southeast Asia, involving pharmaceutical companies that were selling untested medicines to impoverished communities. Jonathan studied the intelligence for several minutes, his engineer's mind automatically calculating response strategies and resource allocation. The Foundation could coordinate with local law enforcement, provide legal support for affected communities, and use public pressure to force regulatory action. But as he prepared to draft response protocols, Jonathan felt a familiar stirring, not the cold fury that had once driven him to violence, but a warm determination to protect the innocent from those who would exploit them. Computer, prepare Foundation response package for Southeast Asian pharmaceutical investigation, he commanded. Full legal support, media coordination, and technology assistance for local authorities. Acknowledged. Response package will be ready for deployment within 6 hours. Jonathan smiled as he watched the Foundation's resources mobilize to protect people he would never meet from predators who thought they were beyond consequences. This was what Mary would have wanted, not the storm of vengeance that had once consumed him, but the gentle persistence of justice working through proper channels. The tornado suits remained sealed in their vault, waiting for threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't handle. But Jonathan hoped they would never be needed again. The world had enough storms. What it needed now was the steady work of building systems that protected the innocent and held predators accountable. As Jonathan prepared to leave his office, he paused one final time before Mary's photograph. "The storm is over, sweetheart," he whispered. "Justice lives on, but now it serves love instead of vengeance. I think that's what you would have wanted." Outside, the Denver skyline glittered under a clear night sky, peaceful and storm-free. In laboratories and boardrooms around the world, the specter of accountability kept potential predators honest, while the Ratch Foundation's work continued the patient business of building a more just world. The man who had once commanded tornadoes had learned to harness an even more powerful force. The love that transforms grief into protection, vengeance into justice, and storms into sanctuary. Mary's legacy lived on, not in the fury of artificial hurricanes, but in the countless lives protected by the love that had survived the darkest storm of all. Epilogue. The gentle wind. 10 years after Mary's death, Jonathan Ratch, now 68 years old, sat in the garden behind his Denver mansion, reading the morning newspaper, in the shade of an oak tree he had planted the day after Mary's funeral. The tree had grown tall and strong over the decade, its branches providing shelter for the birds that Mary had always loved to watch. The headlines were familiar, but reassuring. Corporate crime rate hits all-time low, new pharmaceutical safety standards prevent thousands of deaths, International Anti-Corruption Task Force celebrates 10 years of success. The work continued, but it had become routine now. The patient, methodical business of maintaining systems that protected the innocent and held predators accountable. The Foundation employed over 5,000 people worldwide, coordinating with law enforcement, supporting whistleblowers, and ensuring that the lessons learned from those dark years were never forgotten. Jonathan's secure phone buzzed with an incoming message from the Foundation's early warning system. He glanced at it briefly, evidence of a minor corruption case in Eastern Europe, already being handled by local authorities with Foundation support. The system was working as designed. A gentle breeze stirred the oak tree's leaves, and Jonathan could almost imagine Mary sitting beside him, sharing the quiet satisfaction of work well done. She would have been proud of what they'd built together, not the storm that had once raged across the landscape, but the persistent wind that now kept that landscape clear of predators. In the distance, children were playing in the city park that had been built on the site of Morrison's former headquarters. Their laughter carried on the wind, a sound of innocence protected and futures secured. Jonathan folded the newspaper and stood, his joints protesting slightly with age. He walked to the basement laboratory that had once housed instruments of vengeance, but now contained only the quiet machinery of remembrance, computers that maintained Mary's memorial website, systems that coordinated charitable donations in her name, and in a sealed vault that he hadn't opened in 5 years, the tornado suits that had transformed grief into justice. Computer, status report on global anti-corruption metrics, Jonathan said to the air. Corporate crime prosecution rates, up 340% from baseline. Regulatory enforcement, up 280%. Whistleblower protections, implemented in 47 countries. Estimated lives saved through foundation activities, 3 million. Jonathan nodded with quiet satisfaction. Mary's death had prevented millions of others. Her love transformed into a protective force that spanned the globe. Computer, any threats requiring unconventional response. Negative. All identified threats are being addressed through conventional law enforcement and foundation coordination. Storm protocols remain inactive. Good, Jonathan said softly. Let's keep it that way. He climbed the stairs back to the main house, leaving behind the underground laboratory that had once been his fortress of solitude. The mansion felt different now, not empty, but peaceful. Expectant. As if it were waiting for the next chapter of a story that was finally being written in hope rather than grief. That afternoon, Jonathan received a call from Detective Chen, now Chief Chen of the Denver Police Department. Jonathan, she said, her voice warm with friendship earned through shared purpose. I wanted to let you know the pharmaceutical case in Vietnam was resolved. 7 executives in custody, safety protocols implemented, and the Foundation's legal team made sure the affected communities will receive full compensation. How many lives saved? Jonathan asked. Conservative estimate. About 50,000 people, who won't die from contaminated medicine over the next 5 years. Jonathan smiled. 50,000 people who would live because love had been stronger than grief, because justice had been more persistent than vengeance. Mary would have liked that, he said quietly. I think she would have liked all of it, Chen replied. The foundation, the reforms, the fact that you found peace. You've built something beautiful from something terrible. After the call ended, Jonathan walked to his study and opened the journal he'd been keeping for the past decade. The entries had changed over the years, from the desperate anger of early grief, through the cold calculations of planned vengeance, to the gentle satisfaction of work that honored memory rather than indulging pain. Today's entry was simple: another day, another victory for the innocent. The system works, because we made it work. Mary's love continues to protect people she never met, in places she never saw, through the persistence of justice serving love rather than hate. The storm has passed. The gentle wind remains. And that is enough. Jonathan closed the journal and walked to the window overlooking his garden. The oak tree swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, its leaves catching the sunlight like nature's own holographic display. Somewhere in the world, corporate executives were making ethical decisions, because they remembered what had happened to their predecessors who chose differently. Regulatory officials were enforcing safety standards, because they knew the consequences of corruption. Pharmaceutical companies were prioritizing patient safety, because they understood that some debts could not be paid with legal settlements. The legend of the Tornado Man lived on in boardrooms and government offices, a reminder that accountability could take forms that transcended conventional law enforcement. But the man himself had found something more powerful than fear, the knowledge that love, channeled through patient work and persistent justice, could change the world more completely than any storm. Jonathan Ratch had learned to command hurricanes, but he had discovered that the gentle wind of love was more powerful than any tornado. Mary's legacy lived on, not in the fury of artificial storms, but in the countless lives protected by the love that had survived the darkest night of the soul. The transformation was complete. The storm had become a garden. Vengeance had become sanctuary. And in the end, love had won. The end.